You weary me with proof enough that all this meditation stuff is self-hypnosis. Be it so. Do you suppose I did not know? Still, to be accurate, I fear the symptoms are entirely strange. If I were hard, I'd make it clear that criticism must arrange an explanation different for this particular event. Surely, your best work always finds itself sole object of the mind's. In vain you ply the brush, distracted by something you have heard or acted. Expect some tedious visitor. Your eye runs furtive to the door. Your hand refuses to obey. You throw the useless brush away. I think I hear the word you say. Aleister Crowley.
What we found in your room justified all our fears. How long have you been reading these horrid books?
That old black magic has made.
That's right.
That old black magic
Close your eyes.
The door opened, as though being pulled by some unknown force.
Hello and welcome to the SATE podcast with your hosts Sai and Dylan Andrews. I hope you enjoyed that reading of the poem that I read at the beginning of the episode. It was by Aleister Crowley, and it does touch very lightly on the subject of hypnosis, which is a very interesting area of esoteric and occult knowledge and practice. With that being said, how would we begin to explore this idea? What exactly is hypnosis? And later on, we're going to be exploring whether or not Aleister Crowley was a hypnotist himself. So, Dylan, what is hypnosis?
Yeah, where does one begin? There would be an incredible amount of ways in which one could tackle such a complex subject, and perhaps not one of them would prove capable of doing the task justice. As you know, we have many books on our shelves about hypnosis, and whenever I pick up or receive another, I like to look right away to see how the author goes about describing hypnosis.
And?
Curious enough, most don't really attempt it. I'd be hard-pressed to find a more misunderstood, evocative, and polarizing word or label or concept or state or, whatever the heck it is that we call hypnosis when we make use of the word. It should go without saying, the word hypnosis will frequently be used in our discussing it, along with other words which have in common the same meaning, from magnetism to mesmerism, etc. However, in their repeated use, and with their varied contexts, I'd look not to narrow our focus on what it is and at a later time, with exacted precision, place a finger upon it and go, aha, this is just it. Through this broadcast, I hope that we can broaden our perception and loosen the bars on the cage which confine the concept, so that by the end we may have a more broad approach to it, which brings us more into line with the all-encompassing view of the subject which is shared by mystics such as Marianne Atwood or Eliphas Levi.
Try to guide us through then. What would make a good starting point?
It never hurts to start a discussion with a definition. And in the case of hypnosis, it's rather feeble, but hypnosis in one popular dictionary is described as a trance-like state that resembles sleep, but is induced by a person whose suggestions are readily accepted by the subject, and any of various conditions that resemble sleep. Now, despite this coming from Merriam-Webster, a reputable dictionary, this definition falls quite short, and in many ways, this definition can be viewed as misleading. The association of the concept of hypnosis to a state of sleep is one that has been entrenched in part due to cultural presentations of the subject and the influence of the media, where we have seen many induction methods for hypnosis using the command or shout of "sleep." This has caused many to regard hypnosis and sleep as being similar states, or that a state comparable to sleep is normally induced with hypnosis, when this is simply not true. It could be quite the opposite, in fact. Hypnosis is more closely allied to wakefulness than it is to sleep. And Ormond McGill, in Hypnotism and Mysticism of India, he states that this is an observation that the yogis have made and have known for a long time. Suggestions, both those spoken by another, and autosuggestions or self-suggestions given in hypnosis, have the power to define our perception of the real world in which we interact, create, and destroy while we move about and breathe, which is why Martin T. Orne and David F. Dinges have called the hypnosis phenomenon believed-in fantasy, though, as the band Queen asked, is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Hypnosis can allow us to question what is real, perhaps just as well as drugs can, as the power of hypnotic suggestions contain the power to override stimuli being experienced directly. For example, believing that one tastes is something sour when it is in fact sweet, or believing that one touches something hot when it is in fact the opposite, or is at a regular room temperature. The amazing power of perception and the ability to alter or modify those perceptions through hypnosis or by hypnosis is fascinating if meditated upon and if appreciated fully.
Certainly, though I bet many listeners would be wondering if they could be hypnotized.
And this is where it gets into gray matter, because this approach to hypnosis is the view that hypnosis is an act and is referring to the resulting effects of that act. Addressing this view, barring mental illness, the answer to the question is a resounding yes. I'd also like to inform such a person asking that question that, in my opinion, and it's echoed by many, we are always being hypnotized, always going through trance states, though our understanding as to what that is or means is not yet fully developed. Though we have been toying through religions and mysticism to build a vocabulary to describe it, which may be the reason why we have such difficulty fully grasping or accepting this hypnosis phenomenon. The approach to hypnosis as an act has another common misconception, and that is that it's something that only affects the gullible, the weak-willed, or the dim-witted, when generally it is those of higher intelligence and creativity who have better hypnotizability. And whether or not this statement is true, if you tell it to a volunteer you're working with in hypnosis, you'll likely increase the chances of them suspending their judgment and applying themselves to follow your suggestions, which in turn will lead them to finding success with hypnosis.
Okay.
Sigmund Freud, considered by many as the father of psychoanalysis, had rightfully believed that everybody was hypnotizable. What he falsely believed, however, was that successes of hypnosis were purely contingent upon the effectiveness and skill of the hypnotist involved. Freud had mentioned that any physicians who wish to hypnotize should learn from a master of the art, and noted that even then it will require much practice in order to achieve successes in more than a few isolated cases. And this is certainly a truthfully experienced observation from his point of view, but we can question his conclusions, as it has been said that a good hypnotist needs to learn to take themselves into trance with the patient, staying a few levels above them for the purpose of guidance, as well as knowing how to improvise and work with each individual's needs.
So strong intuitive capabilities and spontaneity seem like they'd be requirements.
Yeah, and it's no surprise that often those are defining qualities of what people call enlightenment. That's no shock. So while the importance of a hypnotist's skill or efficiency is a factor in direct therapeutic or one-on-one demonstrations, it is not an entirely true belief that success hangs almost solely on a hypnotist's shoulders. It takes participation and understanding of both involved, hypnotee and hypnotist. If one believes initially that they don't have much luck entering trance, hypnotizability is a modifiable trait that with the right motivation, aspiration, and training, or in terms of the mystical, the right practice, they can, enhance. Due to hypnosis being bound tightly to association with words such as magic, pageantry, and charlatanry, for therapeutic sessions, psychoanalysts may not use the word to their patients haphazardly, though they are still likely employing its methods. For instance, they may encourage their clients to relax in order to help them associate more freely and loosely with greater ease, and by doing so, this avoids the potential issue of the patient contesting or wondering whether or not they were hypnotized. This odd, was I hypnotized problem is faced by many hypnotherapists and hypnotist consultants after sessions with clients who, despite having produced results in the session, leave more caught up in wanting to question whether or not they were in hypnosis, which has a rather degrading effect on the working that took place. If a psychoanalysis patient were to inquire about the relaxation technique used by their therapist and ask if they were hypnotized, the analyst may end up responding to alert the patient that it's possible for all people to enter a mild hypnotic state as they relax. The trickster archetype rejoices, for duplicity is a major part of hypnosis. It's through hypnosis, John Forrester wrote in Truth Games, Lies, Money, and Psychoanalysis, that the tables are turned, so that instead of the patient deceiving the doctor, it would be the doctor who's doing this deceiving to the patient.
The association of manipulation may raise red flags for some, though. So,
And this tie of deception to hypnosis is not a malicious joke or something of ill intent. The deception of hypnosis just is. On top of that, it's practically inescapable, something we can chalk up to the fallibility inherent within the human experience. Duplicity is as bound into our daily lives as is the influence of culture or religion, or if you'd allow me to be hyperbolic, as bound into our daily lives as is breathing. Since I've mentioned religion, it may be worth noting that hypnosis is practiced and employed in nearly all religions. Margareta K. Bowers, who's a medical doctor, had written that the religionists cannot be in ignorance with their heads in the sand when it comes to the science and the art of the hypnotic discipline.
yeah.
She had also said that whether the religionist approves or disapproves, every effective religionist in their use of ritual, preaching, and worship unavoidably makes use of the hypnotic techniques, and then goes one step further by suggesting that hypnosis is the vehicle by which the services of the religion are brought to the people, manifesting themselves either as good or bad according to the personality of the hypnotist religionist and the rituals they employ. I feel it's also appropriate to introduce something for consideration, which is a general rule of thumb that all hypnosis is self-hypnosis.
Handy.
And I ask that you consider it for a while, as it will help shed light on some of the shadowy, peculiar aspects of hypnosis we'll be sure to come across with the exploration of the subject. The purpose of entertaining this, or the meaning behind it, will likely become more clear as we, for instance, reflect or meditate upon this matter of deception within hypnosis.
Have you got any examples?
Roy Masters, he was the author of over 20 books. He's a talk radio host, and he started a nonprofit organization called the Foundation of Human Understanding. After he'd been introduced to hypnosis in the 1950s, he had opened the Institute of Hypnosis in Houston, Texas, and there he had treated sometimes up to 30 people a day. He had commented that the work he had done there, that he was unhypnotizing people rather than hypnotizing them because they were already asleep, already in a state of trance. With quite a lot of experience under his belt as a hypnotist, in 1979 he published The Satan Principle, Life Itself is Hypnosis, Self-Defense Lessons to Help You Cope with Everyday Pressure. And in it, he laid out, among other beliefs, that, as the title indicated, life itself is hypnosis. The book also happened to mention in brief, I just want to bring this up, that there's a conspiracy from the powers that be who work to keep the masses ignorant about hypnotism by doing certain actions to discredit it, and where they couldn't discredit it fully, they claimed it had therapeutic benefits but presented it in such a way as to keep your average person in the dark about the occult powers innate in each of us.
Yeah.
And as we go about in our daily lives, we're constantly encountering hypnotic stimulation and being influenced therein, so Master suggested as a self-defense antidote to hypnosis that we should take up the practice of meditation. He wrote of hypnosis that it keeps one away from reality. Individuals in trance are wrapped up in their hypnotic dream world and within their imaginations. It's worth pointing out that at a superficial level, meditation and hypnosis, they're both similar things, and they may even be confused for one another. Or, as some recent scientific studies show, they may even be variances of the same thing. The meditation that Master speaks of, however, is not transcendental meditation, which he believes leads one to oblivion, which is, one of the many things, not many, but there's a few things I don't agree with him on, such as associating hypnosis to being something bad. But I do get what he's saying in the context of where he writes that if you concentrate hard enough, you'll become hypnotized, but if you observe gently, you will wake up. And observation is the opposite of concentration, and it's the way you free a fixed attention. And his idea of meditation is, to him, he calls it meditation on God. So to me, it's a bit silly where meditation and hypnosis are separated, and meditation is good and hypnosis is the negative influence, because I feel that this idea of hypnosis being tied to the negative is been perpetuated throughout history, from stories, mythology, and folklore, looking at the ideas such as vampires, or this idea of it being a force used by the elite societies of control.
But it's also how humans have long interacted with the world around them and how they experience the world around them, we find it very difficult to not have things in boxes, to not put things under certain categories. So, for example, the Christians really emphasize the notion of you're either good or you're evil. There's not really an in-between. Do you know what I mean? Or there's black and there's white and there's this and there's that. So I think with the idea of hypnosis being lumped on that negative side, it's also merely because as humans we're not that imaginative. But I don't know. But I can see that those ideas can get dangerous too, huh?
And a perfect example could be Julian Stern, who in 1933 published a book called The Secret of the Zodiac.
Oh, yeah.
And Julian Stern isn't a real name, it's a nom de plume. She's also written under various names, and we will do an episode on her in the future, despite her being a very controversial figure.
I also need to finish reading the book.
Yeah, The Secret of the Zodiac.
And then I can catch up.
But we will go into it because we can trace her to the modern day conservative parties that are in power and her influence and just how widespread it is, but also the research that she did do, because she was quite a proficient researcher. She just had some flawed perspectives that, negatively influenced how people perceive her and, of course, just degraded the quality of her work.
Yes.
But she wrote a book called The Secret of the Zodiac, which detailed a secret global cabal whose top members knew not only of, but utilized hypnosis to control the masses through every means possible, from the newspaper to popular entertainment. This cabal even organized rebellious youth movements and were the puppet masters behind occult organizations and secret fraternities. Stern, whose writings were praised by prominent figures such as Winston Churchill, had even claimed that the book was based on true events. And such fearful ideas of a conspiracy of control or a Rasputin-like figure or something akin to the Svengali Effect, which the Svengali Effect is this negative association to hypnosis based on this book about a hypnotist named Svengali who took a woman and put her into a trance and made her perform. And when she'd perform, she'd have no recollection of it due to amnesia.
Yeah.
And then he died eventually of a heart failure, and she embarrassed herself in front of a crowd not being entranced. And then she died shortly thereafter. So, yeah, this is called the Svengali Effect, this negative, fearful association with hypnosis.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if this fearful association is an automatic reflex. And it's mainly done by those who seem to fixate on connecting hypnosis to a means of controlling others, or as a means of losing self-control, which then makes it justifiable to hold on to a fear of it. This fear is pronounced in certain schools of thought. For example, there's the work of Rosicrucian Max Heindel, who was born in 1865, died in 1919. He had delivered lectures saying that hypnotism was a sin against the Holy Ghost, and that hypnotism is the greatest crime on earth. It seemed to be without redeemable qualities to him, even when used therapeutically. He considered it the greatest danger to society.
Wow.
And with recent AI programs looking to predict people's future behavior and then modify their actions, perhaps Heindel was onto something when he put down the hypnotic techniques of salesmen who lead people to purchases of items or services that they do not need or want.
Okay, so for example, in the line of advertising, for example, everybody knows from a psychological standpoint that the colour red is a very vivid colour, and as humans, we tend to be very attracted to the colour red, which is why a lot of your favourite companies, brands, and such and so forth, and products tend to have red labeling on them because they know that you'll instantly recognize. So, for example, the Coca-Cola analogy is often used when teaching psychology to people. You know as a human being that you want a drink, so you go down to the store to go and purchase a drink, but you don't know which drink you want. But if the Coca-Cola is right at the front of the store with its bright red labeling, you're then sort of coerced into the idea of, oh, I'm just going to buy this Coke. It's probably not going to satiate you in any way, but you feel like you should get that Coke, and therefore the experience of buying that Coke will make you feel like you've been satiated. It's a bit like when women go to the hairdressers to get their hair done, and a lot of the products contain silicone, but the silicone isn't actually helping the hair at all. It literally just sits on the surface of the hair, which is why you're unable to then replicate those hairstyles when you're at home, because the silicone is a layer of fakeness, but obviously more material than the hypnotic idea. But there are some situations, I'm assuming, where people can then say, actually, no, I don't want the Coke. I'm going to go and purchase something else. So I guess that's two different areas, but I don't know. Returning back to fear,
On a spiritual level, what were the reasons for such strong convictions like these?
In the case of Heindel, he viewed that if a hypnotist's vital body had been introduced into the client's vital body, it could not then be entirely withdrawn. And similarly, occultist and magician Dion Fortune, she was convinced that hypnotic methods were largely used in black magic, and that telepathic suggestion was a large proportion of the phenomena. And it may be possible that both of them were speaking of post-hypnotic or deferred suggestions, because a hypnotist can, for example, tell a patient that at a specific time in the future they will re-enter trance, or that upon seeing or hearing a certain signal or trigger, that the trance will be brought about once more or at an equal or greater depth than previously experienced. Mm-hmm. One could also plant the suggestion that they and they alone are able to hypnotize the client. This is known as a seal, and this hypnotic seal is now viewed as unethical, and it was seemingly phased out in the 1950s, but at one point was purportedly done in the medical and or therapeutic professions, in which the suggestion was planted that a patient would only be able to enter trance under the suggestion or influence of a physician, dentist, or qualified psychologist, in a procedure which could be considered locking the unconscious. The seal was said to be done to serve as a protection against an experimenting amateur or stage hypnotists. These seals can be broken, and apparently are still sometimes problematic for hypnotherapists working with a client who is unable to enter trance. And seems to be, I don't know if it's just kind of like a placebo thing that's brought up in hypnotist groups today, but it is still brought up today, and I just don't care to give validity that there's some evil doctors out there saying you will not enter trance on your own, because, you know, it is beneficial to bring ourselves into trance, as we'll look at later with autosuggestion and self-hypnosis.
Yeah. Do you feel these negative aspects are overly exaggerated in any way?
Mm-hmm. As to not be like ignorant or overly naive, these powers of influence and suggestion can be used for ill, or they can be used perversely to control and manipulate, such as we've seen in history with dictatorships or with mind control. However, the beneficial potentiality of hypnosis greatly outweighs the negative, and the possibilities to explore are waiting for us all to connect to our source and recognize the power inherent within ourselves. Perhaps when we realize our own power and the responsibility of these powers, the possibility of manipulation through external agents and events will be greatly weakened, just by us having the knowledge and understanding of the techniques employed against us and the influence upon ourselves, from ourselves, and upon others.
Well, that's really interesting, but at the same time, because that's a lot of back history, and it's really, really essential, especially if you want to get into the world of hypnosis and understand it and employ it within your magical workings if need be. But many are probably still wondering at this point, what is hypnosis and what are these powers of which you speak?
Yeah, and sorry folks, but hypnosis is not easily offered for understanding. William James, he once wrote that the intimate nature of the hypnotic condition, when induced, can hardly be said to be understood. And occult icon, writer, and researcher Colin Wilson, he too in his book Mysteries, mentioned that many books have had a chapter under headings such as "What is hypnosis?" and said that the answer could be cut down to just 3 words.
Well, don't leave me hanging, what are they?
They are, "We don't know."
Of course.
And it's hard to argue with either of them, but Wilson does acknowledge that hypnotism appears to be one method of reaching the wider or unknown areas of the self, which are beyond the ego consciousness that most of us think of as me. Thankfully, scientific research is starting to peel back a part of this veil and is helping us understand a little better about what hypnosis is and what it does.
That's really good. So, since that's something more concrete to grasp, can you go into some of these scientific studies?
Gladly. Research has shown that the act of hypnotism decreases the activity within the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, just saying that makes me feel smart, which is the region of the brain known to be critical for evaluating context. It aids in deciding what is worth putting attention upon, as well as deciding what is worth ignoring in particular situations. This proves that a hypnotized person is able to suspend their judgment and immerse themselves wholly in an activity without thinking of what else they should or could be attending, and keeps them maintaining a one-pointed focus. And that particular study also found that hypnosis made a change in some parts of the brain that give people the ability to separate their thoughts in their heads from the feelings in their body, such as they're able to picture something stressful while the body's still relaxing.
Yeah.
And lastly, the third region of the brain affected involves self-consciousness, which would mean that one can do things with less self-conscious doubt arising, which would open up one socially, etc. Stanford psychiatry professor David Spiegel had a great quote in an interview with the CNBC about the findings, and would you care to read it?
Yeah, sure. It says here, I think this illustrates the reality of hypnosis as a phenomenon and the fact that this is not a way of losing control, as a lot of people fear. It is a way of teaching people to enhance control over their brains and bodies.
The results of the finding are most fitting to what James Braid believed in his later relationship with hypnosis. Braid was a British ophthalmologist who tried to change the term he himself popularized in hypnosis to what he felt was the more appropriate term, monoideism, meaning single ideism, for representing the state of one-pointed absorption of the mind. And again, similarly, this comparison to samadhi is the term samadhi refers to a one-pointed absorption or trance where the mind becomes still, and it is in samadhi where subject and object become unified as one whole. So the artist and their utensil become one, or a swordsman and their sword are one.
Yeah. So again, there's a blending of hypnosis and mysticism right there.
Yeah, and it should be no surprise that in the writings of Aleister Crowley, we'll find that he placed an emphasis upon the practice of samadhi. And as we've played with already in an entertaining Life is Hypnosis, we're always entering various trance states, or perhaps we can hold the perspective that we're always in a trance state, with our level of absorption into that trance and the type of trance being the variable that is fluctuating. Perhaps what's different in those moment-to-moment transitions is that there is a way to best understand the trance we're in, and we suffer or are disconnected or out of whack, if not in the correct one.
Okay, so could you talk a little bit about some of these trance states, or this trance state?
Yeah. A good example to bring to mind for anyone who has driven a car would be to recognize the common state which in 1921 was coined road hypnotism, and later white line fever, and also highway hypnosis. This is a manifestation of the process of automaticity, where one conducts actions without conscious awareness of having enacted them. This means that one could drive for a great duration, maneuvering their vehicle and responding to external events on the road, yet retain little to no conscious recollection of doing so when they suddenly come into a realization of where they have taken themselves.
Yeah.
Or upon reaching their destination, they notice that there was an absence of felt time. Automaticity takes place in less dangerous activities than driving. It can occur during normal or mundane functions such as walking, drawing, or even can take place whilst writing.
Yeah, I think we've all experienced that. Like, you just sort of, you're out and about doing your own thing, and then suddenly it's like, wait, how did I get here? What am I doing here?
Yeah, just zoning out, right? And with regards to the trances experienced in hypnosis, any depth scale, there are, in lots of schools of thought, there are different depth scales. And while there are little indicators and differences, there are many different mappings of them, so they're all kind of arbitrary. There's the Davis-Husband scale, which maps 30 levels.
Whoa.
The Lacron-Bardot scale maps 50 levels. The Stanford scale has 12. The Ahrens depth scale has 6. And just for a better ease of understanding the subject, and for an idea of what such a scale may look like, we can make an approximation here of just a basic 6-stage depth scale.
Okay, so we'll stick with the 6. So what would be stage 1?
Hypnoidal, which is a light trance. It's hypnopompic or hypnagogic. And, you know, as you close your eyes at night, you get hypnagogic imagery. Those are those kind of like blue swirls that go in your eyelids and such. It's light trance. It's catalepsy of the small muscles.
Okay, and what's stage 2?
Catalepsy of medium-sized muscles, impairment of critical reasoning.
And what is stage 3?
It's catalepsy of the entire body. So it's partial analgesia. Fucking word. It's partial
Analgesia.
analgesia.
So you got me doing it now.
Partial analgesia. And sorry, I'm not a doctor. I've read this word a bunch of times, but now that I have to speak it out,
It's a whole different
game. Partial analgesia, partial amnesia, and so for example, this trance can be induced and you start forgetting things such as forgetting numbers.
Yeah. And stage 4.
This is now amnesia, analgesia. You will not feel discomfort, but will feel sensation of touch.
Stage 5.
Now you're entering into somnambulism.
Okay.
Complete anesthesia. You can also have positive hallucinations, which is like seeing or hearing things which do not exist.
And what is stage 6?
Stage 6 is profound somnambulism. It's negative hallucinations. There's a demonstration that I can recall where, for example, a man was made to focus on a watch, and they had his daughter stand in front of it, and he was placed into a trance where he could not see his daughter, so he could still see the watch despite her standing in front of it. That's just kind of an example.
Wow, that's extreme.
yeah. So you won't be able to see or hear things that are in the environment.
That's right there. So I'm sure this is a lot for those unfamiliar with the subject. So why are there so many variances with the scales?
Yeah, it's a complex matter, and to be honest, I don't have all the answers there. So we can simplify it. Jean-Martin Charcot, his theory divided hypnotic trance into the categories of lethargy, catalepsy, and somnambulism. And as we're not going to be doing dentistry or needing any complications with regard to these trance levels, we can, for efficiency, just reduce the scale to 3 levels in our own right. And I like to do so, so let's just refer it to light, medium, and deep trance. Colin Wilson recalls in The Occult a discussion that he had with the poet Robert Graves, who brought up the topic of a dominant 5%, which Wilson stated in the study of zoology, it's indicated that all animals have a dominant 5%, including humans. The power that distinguishes leaders is seen in those able to concentrate the will in emergencies with what Wilson calls Faculty X. It is this Faculty X, he suggests, that the magicians, witch doctors, witches, and mediums, as members of the dominant 5%, have developed. Wilson in The Occult also points out that Dr. Stephen Black, in his Mind and Body book, informed us that most people can be hypnotized if they cooperate, but only a small number of people are deep trance subjects, and coincidentally enough, the number that have the ability to enter this trance is apparently 5%.
Holy.
I believe that's mostly conjecture, but those able to enter into the ultra deep state, they are less common than those able to enter into medium level trance through hypnosis, which is not of much concern at all in terms of practicality, as ultra depth isn't required for autosuggestion, nor working with visions such as the method called past life regression, which you and I have experimented with, and which surely we'll talk about on this podcast in the future.
Absolutely, that was really interesting.
Just before we move on, I do want to mention that philosopher and writer Aldous Huxley, in a letter to George Orwell, who's the author of Animal Farm, 1984, Politics in the English Language. Huxley had indicated that he had looked into the history of animal magnetism and hypnotism, and wrote how he was greatly struck by how the world has refused to take serious cognizance of the discoveries of Mesmer, Braid, Esdale, and he blamed this overlooking of hypnosis on the prevailing trend of materialism by saying that the 19th century philosophers and scientists were not willing to investigate the odder facts of psychology. Huxley also blamed Freud's inability to hypnotize successfully as being what in part had manifested Freud's consequent disparagement of hypnotism.
Though Freud on Netflix would definitely put a highlight on hypnosis, and the series was actually really good, so watch it because the actors are amazing and the set design and costumes are absolutely fantastic, but there is so much I could say about Freud, which I will refrain from doing here. We've thus far offered a definition of hypnosis, but I have heard auto-hypnosis and auto-suggestion brought up. Could you elaborate on them a little bit more?
Yep. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary's definition of autosuggestion is an influencing of one's own attitudes, behavior, or physical condition by mental processes other than conscious thought, while the definition of auto-hypnosis is self-induced and usually automatic hypnosis. The word auto in auto-hypnosis is referring to the Greek autos, meaning self. Self-hypnosis is a highly suggestible state wherein suggestions are directed to the self, and with skill and effort, it can be just as powerful as heterohypnosis.
Okay.
And heterohypnosis is where hypnotic trance is induced by another individual who also reinforces with suggestion or offers appropriate suggestions for treatment or desired ends.
Okay, right.
And as we said of hypnosis being a part of everyday life, so too are suggestions leading to hypnosis an everyday part of our daily or routine existence. We can with utmost confidence say that they are inseparable. To see this, it would take no more than a look at the formative years of human beings, when a crying child who has experienced an injury of some sort will be brought out of a state of distress, and it will be remedied by the touch of a mother's kiss or a caress alone. This caring act being reinforced by the suggestion, there, this will make everything better. When we change our thinking, we change our beliefs. When we change our beliefs, we change our behaviors. To change our thinking, we can introduce suggestion and the resulting chain effect. The introduction of suggestion will change our beliefs, which will change our feelings and our general disposition, which can then drastically change our thoughts, actions, and our lives. The benefits of healthy thinking cannot be understated. Autosuggestion, though, is not merely affirmations and positive thinking, though both of those could be considered aspects of the self-hypnotic technique. Autosuggestion is in some ways linked to the placebo effect, which we will be touching upon shortly.
So, when was autosuggestion popularized?
The concept of autosuggestion was popularized by Émile Coué. He was born, I think, in 1857 and died in the early 1900s. He was a French psychologist who introduced the method of psychotherapy that utilized self-improvement based on optimistic autosuggestion. Coué instructed his patients to take a piece of string with about 30 knots tied into them.
Okay.
The patients would then run the string through their fingers as if to count every knot, though instead they would say or gabble to themselves, tous les jours et de pont de vue, je vais de mieux en mieux. The translation into English, which would be considered the most satisfactory, is day by day and every day in every way I get better and better. And she's just laughing at my French because I'm horrible.
I mean, you're getting better, but I think it's because I have like French relatives, so I'm used to speaking like European French, not
and I don't
Dylan French.
I don't know French
or Canadian French. It's different. It's nice.
With autosuggestion, the words alone do not suffice. One must pair the words with belief, sensing or enacting that what they're saying is truth already. The words and suggestions are not being repeated to persuade oneself, as persuasion is not suggestion.
Yeah, it kind of plays into that whole idea of what you think you become or what you say is a form of uttering magic out loud. So if people were to practice perhaps using their fingers at night before you go to bed, if you practice on each finger by saying, every day and in every way I get better and better, every day and in every way I get better and better, and you keep doing that, the next few days you're going to feel really great. And it's such a weird feeling. You can't really put your finger on that feeling, but it makes you feel good. And I think that's part of the reason why when it comes to strict occult practices and observances for like daily rituals and things like that, it's important to be strict and have discipline with yourself, because you can really feel the differences when you have that discipline and you perform those daily rituals every day. Mm-hmm. Like, and if you skip a few days, you feel bad, you feel guilty, you feel like you've let yourself down. And it's also really important in that sense as well to record when you've done these things. And even on days when you don't really feel like recording anything, just write it down anyway and say, okay, today I don't want to feel like recording anything, because at least you've managed to record something. It's not that you haven't done anything. Do you know what I mean?
And you said something about speaking what you create. That's abracadabra, right?
Yeah.
I will speak as what I create, or
yeah,
I forget what it exactly translates as. I speak as I create, or something like that.
Yeah, it's magic. It's just yeah. So I can't help but mention how similar that is to the Buddhist or Christians using prayer beads or mala japa or mala beads. It's very similar. I like that. It's actually kind of cool.
And one doesn't need a string or beads to utilize the method of gabbling, which Coué said was the surest method of communicating with one's subconscious. Whilst relaxed in bed every night, as you were saying, when we're close, like either it's like if it's right upon awakening or as we're kind of drifting off, these are both close to those hypnagogic states. We could just use our hands and hovering our fingers above the bed, place the palms gently down, raise each finger uniformly without strained or sustained effort.
Yeah.
And with the raising of each finger, condition ourselves with the suggestion. And at last, when all 10 fingers are raised, we can go through once more, bringing them back down to rest upon the bed. Coué said of autosuggestion that it is a double-edged sword and emphasized our personal responsibility because of this. When used, it will work wonders, but if it is used improperly, it'll bring about disastrous results.
i.e. Instagram, where people just put up quotes and they think, oh my god, I'm so not McCray today, so I'm going to put up this really cute affirmation. I'm totally awesome. But they don't actually change as people because they're literally just putting out a quote. They're not actually practicing that mantra every single day. It's literally just for clout.
It's
And
the
then
intention.
it's the intention, but the intention isn't a very strong one, and then it doesn't really last. But when they do make those posts, it could be helpful for someone who happens to stumble across that picture, and then that person will say, okay, that's going to be my mantra every day for a week, or every day for a month, or once a week, and such and so forth. But I don't know, it just depends. That's just something that I've observed in the new social media wild.
And Koo said that prior to his expounding upon the subject in his book, My Method, autosuggestion was a force used unconsciously, and at that, it was a force used to make or reinforce bad suggestions to ourselves.
Yeah.
So knowing this, we need to utilize it for the beneficial effects. And this statement ringing eerily close to one made by Aleister Crowley in his extolling the practice of magic. To paraphrase once more, the reason for practicing magic is that we've already unconsciously been doing it, so knowing that, we should do it well rather than poorly. And it was clear to Koo that by means of thought we are absolute masters of our physical organism, and that the ancients showed us that thought and suggestion have the power to cure and produce disease.
Yeah.
Even Pythagoras, Emile Koo in his book My Method, he says that Pythagoras had taught autosuggestion to his disciples, offering the quote, God the Father, deliver them from their sufferings and show them what supernatural power is at their call.
Yeah. So, what contributes to success in autosuggestion?
Autosuggestion success will be based on a few factors. While there are others, and surely we could arbitrarily construct some more, the three most important laws of suggestion come from the work of Emile Koo, and they are the law of concentrated attention, the law of dominant effect, and the law of reversed effect.
Okay, so let's break them down a little bit. Just explain briefly to me what the law of concentrated attention is.
Yeah. When attention is placed upon an idea repeatedly, it tends to realize itself. For example, if you're focusing on seeing a number, you may start seeing it everywhere. Robert Anton Wilson's phrase, what the thinker thinks, the prover proves, is rather apropos to this law. If one's always thinking they are ill, they may begin to manifest illness just in identifying with the belief.
Yes.
And this cannot be understated enough.
That is true. It's like I have a slight terror of millipedes and centipedes, so I've managed to convince myself that they are everywhere, that I just can't see them. And so I can't walk anywhere without looking. I can't go in the dark without having a torch because I'm convinced that they're there. But at the same time, I can sort of bring myself out of that by just trying to bring back those elements of reality by saying, no, if I see a centipede, I'll see it. If I don't, then I don't see it. So just enjoy the fact that I'm not seeing it more than I am actually seeing it. So it's awesome, but it's also super annoying because millipedes are gross. Okay, so in that case, let's continue on. What is the law of dominant effect?
The law of dominant effect is that the stronger emotions will always win out. So when doing suggestion work, it helps to attract a strong emotion as it makes the suggestion more effective. A physiological effect could be used to reinforce the psychological suggestion. For example, if you're doing heterohypnosis and suggesting that someone relaxes, you could stroke them or give them a massage, which will allow the suggestion to be more potent and be better received or followed. Or, as we touched upon, a mother will soothe her child and relieve their pains by kissing the boo-boo and saying that in so doing, it'll make everything better. However, negative and fearful or limiting emotions may often displace positive ones, so building up a healthy disposition and a positive thinking, it is extremely beneficial to one's practice.
Okay, that's pretty cool. And the very last point, what is the law of reversed effect?
The law of reversed effect is, the harder you consciously try to do something, the less chance you have of success. It's perhaps with this law in mind that Aleister Crowley wrote, "For pure will, unassuaged of purpose, delivered from the lust of result, is every way perfect." You may remember a time in childhood when, under extreme pressure, for example, when having to undergo a written test, that when you sat down and prepared to write, you only found like an inability to come up with the answers to the questions. And despite having studied, Your mind's blank and all the knowledge is just absent. And the harder and harder you concentrate on remembering the answers,
Yes.
the more you exert your will on doing so, the farther the memory of those answers flew away, and consequently the more stressed you become. And perhaps when you were finally relieved of the pressure and anxiety, so like when you were walking away from the testing room, when the relaxation began to set in and you just like had to deal with the consequences.
That's when all the answers
Yeah,
hit you.
the
You
answers
just-
all return as if to mock you in their realization.
You just kind of think, oh, for goodness sake.
The application of effort has a possibility of bringing upon the opposite effect.
Yeah, that's
And
so true.
and that's common, you know, like if someone's really trying hard to get pregnant, they have to let the thought go.
Yeah.
And then they may find more success.
Yes. So hard, but yes. Another example could be when someone is trying to fall asleep with their attention focusing on the desire to sleep, they may keep themselves perpetually awake. That is something that I have to deal with on almost a daily basis, which is why I struggle. I lay there for about 2 hours saying to myself, okay, go to sleep, go to sleep.
And
Go
I
to
do it
sleep.
too when I'm knowing like, oh, I have 4 hours now, I have to get up for work and I have to get to sleep, and yeah, and then you prevent yourself from sleeping.
But it doesn't help that you just then whip out your phone in the pitch black and start scrolling through Reddit like, I can't sleep, so I'm just going to stare at my phone for an hour.
When it comes to delivering or thinking suggestions, their structuring is very important to pay attention to for increasing their effectiveness. An example could be with bringing anesthesia to a limb. If in heterohypnosis the suggestion was delivered as, I want your foot to become numb, there is a less chance of success than if the hypnotist would offer a suggestion using descriptive sensory information, such as asking the patient to imagine their foot entering into ice cold water, ever so cold, asking them to notice the sensations, to feel the tingles, and to notice the heaviness of their foot. The importance of the language when it comes to self-hypnosis is equally important. Suggestions should be in positive tones and be simple, believable, and in the present tense. So instead of something such as, I will stop smoking, we'd rather use, I'm a non-smoker. Though that example is kind of conflated even because just the idea of saying the word smoker, you're associating to smoking.
Yeah.
But this whole aspect is neurolinguistic programming, which is worth looking into, just how to modify our own language and internal language use, not only when speaking to others, but just with our own dialogues. And you can use suggestions even to create examples which may on the surface appear negative. For example, creating this revulsion to cake so that you'll feel ill and sick to when you see or smell cake. If you don't have the willpower to stop yourself from eating cake, you can then create an aversion to it.
Yeah.
Our imaginations really are the limits to like the usefulness of these techniques.
But I will continue to eat the cake. So if you don't want the cake, at some point, if you contact me, you can send me all the money for the cake and I'll just eat the cake myself. I'll do it in your honour. If Okay, thank you, dear listener. Just give me all the cake, especially if it's lemon drizzle. Anything with lemon, I'm quite partial to that. Okay. Oh my god. Okay, anyway. Can autosuggestion even open the doors to magical experiences?
Absolutely, since we were on the topic of sleep. For those who are trying to induce lucid dreams, autosuggestion and utilizing post-hypnotic suggestions can greatly increase the frequency of them. Stephen LeBerg, he wrote a great book called Exploring the World of Lucid Dreaming, which offers an autosuggestion technique of laying in bed, closing the eyes, and sending relaxation throughout the body, releasing all muscular and mental tension, and slowing down one's breathing. Then, similar to what we looked at before, you tell yourself that you will have a lucid dream. And he notes the importance of not putting intentional effort into the suggestions, but to put oneself into the expectation of genuine success while delivering the suggestion, like putting thoughts towards imagining the dream that will come. And Charles Tart said of post-hypnotic suggestion that it may offer the most powerful technique for content control of dreams via pre-sleep suggestion. Lastly, the ceremonial magician Hermeticist Franz Barden. He had written in his magnum opus, Initiation into Hermetics, that the subconscious is the Satan, the adversary, and that it will almost always succeed in overcoming us, especially if the willpower is weak and undeveloped. This very much echoes the law of reversed effect. Barden instructs that if we withdraw the notion of time and space when we impregnate the subconscious with a wish, that the positive part of the subconscious is effective within us, and the upper or normal consciousness is then coordinated with it. He says that this knowledge and possibility is of the greatest significance for magical development and must always be considered when practicing autosuggestion.
Yeah.
Barden emphasized utilizing all aspects of life for using suggestions. So he impregnates food before it's being eaten. He impregnates water if it's being drunk. He uses beads to program the subconscious and to do suggestion work before bed and upon awakening.
So you asked me to read a quote from Eliphas Levi, and it says, "To live is to suffer. To know how to live is to be happy. To love is to obey. To know how to love is to rule. To speak is to make a noise. To know how to speak is to make melody. To seek is to torment oneself. To know how to seek is to find. To use is often to abuse. To know how to use is to enjoy. To practice magic is to be a quack. To know magic is to be a sage. To believe without knowing is to be a fool. To know without believing is to be a mad titan. True knowledge brings with it faith."
Yeah, and Aleister Crowley has a chapter titled Chinese Music in the Book of Lies, where the first line reads, "Explain this happening," and to which the following line proclaims, "This happening is to have a natural cause," the next stating that it must have had a supernatural cause. "Let these two asses be set to grind corn," is the response to both. Crowley's commentary upon the chapter reminds the reader that skepticism keeps the mind fresh, whereas faith dies in the very sleep it induces.
Yeah.
Faith could be defined as complete trust or confidence in something or someone. In Western culture, we have a tendency to connote ignorance to the term, as Crowley's above instance highlighting a blind faith was indicating a trance induced by ignorance, and many equate this entirely to the word faith. In terms of the esoteric, however, faith, or saradha, is a prerequisite for embarking on the Buddhist Eightfold Path, though it is kind of a faith that requires critical reflection and leads to the cultivation of insight and understanding. For a Christian perspective on faith, in the New Testament, the word for faith is pistis, which etymologically is derived from I persuade. Perhaps by looking at faith as being persuaded into truth, or to come into truth or an acceptable perception of reality, we can see how Levi would say that true knowledge brings with it faith. As for the practice of autosuggestion goes, faith is definitely an ally and intrinsic part of the experience. When giving oneself suggestions, as mentioned previously, it helps to say it with faith. If you believe the practice of suggestion to be powerless, or if your mind should be full of doubts, as Robert Anton Wilson said, "The thinker thinks and the prover proves." Faith has the ability to repose itself upon reason, and thus the greater your faith, the more radical and rapid are the possibilities of the results in your practice of autosuggestion. So we may view faith as absolute belief, but in a healthy sense. These beliefs can be reinforced with repetition, such as religious ritual and ritualistic activities, making them more firmly entrenched in our mind and being. And while autosuggestion is aided by faith, the placebo effect finds itself more rooted deep within faith. In order for, say, a sugar pill placebo to be effective, the taker of it must believe in the prestige of the physician who gives it to them. This trusty rapport could be built by impressions from the environment the pill is administered in, the hypnotic effect of the giver's dress or uniform, and just what that dress or uniform implies of the education and authority that they hold in order to be administering the drug in the first place.
It's like with doctors and surgeons in a hospital setting talking to you before you have surgery. It's the bedside manner. But they won't obviously admit to it being a form of hypnosis. So
Yeah, and it's just the patient's belief that the physician knows their condition or ailment, and with certainty that the drug being given will cure or deliver its effects. Perhaps a combination of these elements provide a powerful suggestion for overcoming the ailment, and which is why when people were more ignorant of the placebo effect in hypnotism, we can see how Mesmer's fancy dress and theatrics may have resulted in curing people by suggestion alone, even if his antics within his work were later deemed unscientific under scrutiny. Suggestions are powerful. They can shape our belief, which in turn affect our physiology and our physical well-being.
So where exactly does the word placebo actually come from?
Psalm 114:9 of the Bible reads, Placebo domino in region vivorum. And excuse me, my Latin is worse than my French. In English, it's I shall please the Lord in the land of the living. The word placebo is etymologically derived from placio, I please. Placebo, I shall please, became medical jargon just prior to the 1800s, and the effect has to this day remained pretty mysterious. That isn't to say that it doesn't have a history of pleasing and providing results. The placebo effect has, in some instances and trials, proved to be more potent than an expected drug's effect.
Yeah.
And while the placebo found itself in regular vernacular, lesser known in our cultural lexicon is nocebo, which Walter Kennedy introduced as a counterpart to placebo, with nocebo, I shall harm, being derived from the Latin noceo, I harm. With nocebo, the effect being similar to the placebo, though there's a negative consequence in the interaction.
Okay.
So a few times, we've looked at people who associated black magic to hypnosis. Mm-hmm. It may be worth considering that if we were to attribute placebo to hypnosis, perhaps black magic and curses can be attributed to hypnosis as well, though under the umbrella of the nocebo effect, where people get sick from bad interactions.
Right.
And interactions aren't just with the external. Interactions internal have effect on us too. Anxiety and repressed or suppressed emotions, such as rage, can cause us physical discomfort and pains. There's a doctor, Dr. Johnny Sarno. He's a physician and professor of clinical rehabilitation, and he says in his book, The Mind-Body Prescription, that the pain epidemic plaguing Western society is entirely the result of the nocebo. He had chosen the name TMS for this painful affliction. TMS being an abbreviation for tension myositis syndrome, which is also known as tension myoneural syndrome and mind-body syndrome. Sarno claims the cure to TMS is the acquisition of information, as it is knowledge that relieves the pain. Some people are reportedly relieved of their pains by the very act of reading his book itself. TMS is a controversial subject matter, as TMS diagnosis has not yet been accepted by the mainstream medical community, though it's not without its supporters within the medical community, such as Andrew Weir and Dr. Oz, along with thousands of patients whose testimonies fly in the face of the skeptical crowd. Sarno lays out in the book a lot of interesting materials worth pondering upon, such as the idea that surgery may sometimes merely be placebo. He brings up a study from the New England Journal of Medicine by Maureen Jensen, in which lumbar MRIs were done on 98 people with no history of low back or leg pain. In the findings were details that 52% had a bulging disc and 27% had a disc protrusion, with the conclusion of the study being that by the discovery of the MRI, the bulges or protrusions in people with low back pain may frequently be coincidental. We can hypothesize that if someone with TMS had visited their doctor, received an MRI, and were shown a visual image of the peculiarity or deterioration which comes naturally with age to their spine, the act of being told by a doctor that it is the source of pain may be the nocebo effect, where they then have to justify themselves the pain being experienced, and this would mean that the surgery being performed may only temporarily alleviate the pain, or perhaps the pain would transition to another area or organ of the body, being that it was a pain psychogenic in origin.
Yeah, so as long as you keep, like if you say to someone, this is something that's gone wrong, that person will then be convinced from that point on, oh my God, everything's wrong because that one thing is wrong. And it's like, no, you're fine. Stop being so silly. But with that said, there is so much to think about. So I can see why you love researching this so much. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the basis of our marriage and it drives me insane, but it still keeps bringing me back because I'm still kind of intrigued myself. So, yeah.
And speaking of love, hypnosis and love stroll alongside one another hand in hand. Sigmund Freud hearkened hypnosis to love, with the exclusion of sexual satisfaction, believing that the hypnotist awakens a portion of the archaic heritage in their subject which had initially made them compliant towards the authority of their parents. Love can be considered etymologically to come from the Sanskrit lub, which means to desire, to covet, to enchant, to make crazy, to entice, or to be perplexed. As noted by hypnotist Ormond McGill, the will to live could be aptly renamed the will to love, as the chief activity of the will to live consists in sex attraction and manifestation. McGill writes in Hypnotism and Mysticism of India of a love energy utilized by the magician, comparing it to a storage battery, a stored-up reservoir of love. Love energy is described like a bolt of lightning seeking instinctively for a place to strike and discharge its energy. This love energy is capable of hypnotizing an individual and fixating their attention, and a love of love itself can also hypnotize an individual, leading them astray in a kind of psychic blindness. In addition to the force of love energy, is a sexual magnetism, a psychophysical polarity present in men and women, though we know of gender fluidity and sexual attraction in opposite sexes are more commonly acknowledged these days. Yeah. In the book, McGill notes that this is a natural attractive force between people of the opposite sex. And yogis are mindful of this sex magnetism and aim to transmute it into ojas. In the Hindu tradition, it's believed that by practicing celibacy, the spiritual aspirant inwardly transforms life energy into ojas, which translates into human magnetism. Or, I don't speak Sanskrit, Urdhvareda. Urdhvareda means the preservation of human magnetism in the body, with Urdhva meaning higher and Reda meaning engrossed. Yogis say that the sex energy can be changed into ojas by utilizing both rhythmic breathing and focusing on the Muladhara chakra, which is the root support or root chakra, located at the base of the spine, that the Kundalini energy lays dormant within and can be activated for its ascent.
I was just about to say with Kundalini yoga, because that's my area of expertise. But yeah, continue.
Mm-hmm. The serpent power, the Kundalini, then uses the ojas as a kind of nourishing element and is believed to intensify psychic powers. This generation of the ojas and principle of elevating love to a divine love reminds me of, the writings of Jacob Boehme, who said, "The majority of souls depart from the terrestrial forms without the body of Christ, which is divine love, but being connected there with only by a small thread. Such souls, having but little spirituality, will not exist in such glorious bliss as those whose spirituality has been unfolded upon the earth and who loved God above all."
Yeah. Or in Thelema, for example, love is the law, but love is agape, the word for a higher love.
Mm-hmm. True love, natural love, is the miracle of magnetism, according to Levi. In The Great Secret, or Occultism Unveiled, it is the intertwining of the two serpents of the caduceus. Levi's belief harkened back to some of the views of Paracelsus, which too were similar to those held by Robert Flood, who believed that each individual shared a magnetic polarization with the earth itself, positive or negative, active or passive. These differences would lead to natural attractions and aversions between people based on their respective emanations. An important feature of magnetism is the idea of influence at a distance. Paracelsus taught On the Foundation of Wisdom that in order to become like God, we must become attracted to God, and the power that attracts us to the foundation of all is divine love. He also taught that the earthly sun, which as a cause of heat, those who are blind can still feel or sense the heat. Similarly, he said that there's an eternal sun, the source of wisdom, which those whose spiritual senses have awakened to life will be able to see and be conscious of it. And those who have not yet attained spiritual consciousness, they may feel his power by the inner faculty known as intuition.
Yeah.
And as we've repeated a few times already, hypnosis is a part of all religions. The work of Rabbi psychologist Samuel Glasner and Margareta Bowers, titled Auto-Hypnotic Aspects of the Jewish Kabbalistic Concept of Kavanah, compares the Jewish Kabbalistic state of Kavanah with auto-hypnosis. In Jewish theology, ritual or prayer success is entirely dependent on achieving Kavanah, which implies concentration and correct intention, as Kavanah literally means intention or sincere feeling, direction of the heart. Kavanah was used to induce a state of religious ecstasy, a state of deeper understanding and experiencing God in inner reality. Talmudic scholars note that Kavanagh was used to produce depersonalization so that the prophets could see themselves elsewhere. Bowers and Glasner were impressed by the auto-hypnotic nature of the methods employed by the Kabbalistic philosopher and mystic Abraham Abulafia. Yeah. The resulting hypnotic fantasies of his work offered new insights and truths by his concentrating upon the magical properties of the Hebrew letters, starting with Tetragrammaton, Yod-He Vav-He, and arranging the letters to develop 99 further names of God. Abulafia was one of the earliest Kabbalists. His system was called Prophetic Kabbalah, and it had the ultimate goal of obtaining community with God. His practice for the generations of names of God employed the use of gematria, the symbolic employment of letters as numerals, notarikon, regarding each letter in a word as the initial of some other word, and so making of it an acrostic. He also used tamura, which is the substitute of one letter for another, and of zuruf, which is connecting various letters of the same word. Aleister Crowley, when he came to full term as a mystic, had realized that the content of a prayer or invocation is not so much determinate of its efficiency, but it is the intensity or proper intent the candidate or celebrant can bring in its utterance. On one occasion in 1906, for example, he was reciting Reginald Heber's From Greenland's Icy Mountains, in extremis, an incredibly difficult situation. Crowley found it effective at that moment. We can easily compare his teaching to inflame oneself in prayer with the concept of Kavanagh. This instance of Crowley mentioned is akin to entering samadhi by words, when words lead one's human consciousness to become one with the cosmic consciousness.
That really plays heavily into the role of magic and casting spells and doing rituals. You can't just cast a spell if you don't believe in it. You can't do a ritual if you don't believe in it and then believe that it will happen, which is why old school witches especially don't particularly like to discuss their prayers with tools and other accessories with people so openly so much, because the idea of uttering the magic that you have just created and spent time imbuing yourself with, the energies that you've also managed to raise within that particular ritual, is so incredibly personal and unique to you that you have, well, previously anyway, the old school witches were taught, don't say anything until that ritual or that spell has brought about the desired outcome that you want. So it's like with people that I used to sort of help out and teach in the past when they were first getting into the world of witchcraft and the occult and learning to understand ritual and things, when I started telling them about the idea of discipline and being able to perform daily practices, whether it's meditation or performing Liber Resh every single day, or going to your altar if you happen to follow a form of Egyptian paganism or Hermeticism, and following through with your yoga as part of your prayers and daily sort of discipline, if you don't imbue yourself in that, I guess you could call that like auto-suggestion, then whatever spells or magic you decide to work later on will be affected by those particular levels of energies that you've managed to conjure about. And
well, all ritual is hypnosis, right?
Yeah.
All spell work is hypnosis. Everything is hypnosis.
That's the whole
and
point. But
that's just why it gets so fuzzy, right? And it's distinguishable, but it's also fuzzy. And once we've begun observing and understanding the phenomenology of hypnosis, we're able to see it where it's not explicitly stated or identified as such. For example, Rabbi Joseph Ben Akiva, author of the collection of papers called the Masa Merkava, The Way or the Working of the Chariot, he taught a method consisting of visualizations such as an infinitely bright light and the images of heavenly places, and he had induced out-of-body experiences and had his believers reaching heights of ecstasy. His disciples would be achieving meditative states of mind through the use of biblical passages and chants the rabbi had composed himself.
yeah, it's still being used today. Like, that's why you, for example, if you watch people who are praying at the Wailing Wall, it's not merely the act of praying. It's the fact that they are literally becoming one with the words, they're becoming one with the prayer, and thus they're becoming one with the universe and the higher energies about them. And it becomes a very emotional experience. And then once you've actually experienced something like that, you never want to let it go. You want to keep practicing it to try and get better and better and make deeper connections. It's truly wonderful. I don't know. It's just, you should see it. Do any great occult thinkers place hypnosis in its appropriate pedestal?
Yeah. Theosophist H.P. Blavatsky in Isis Unveiled considered magnetism and its mystery the great universal solvent, the alkahest. She wrote with contempt that the men of science who had rejected and turned their backs upon magnetism and mesmerism, that in their doing they shut the doors which led to the greatest mysteries of nature before themselves.
Yeah. During her life, Blavatsky gained popularity hosting seances, which demonstrated supposed abilities such as thought reading, automatic writing, which is something I do, spirit rapping, and spirit channeling, and other manifestations of supernatural phenomena.
In 1884, after a fallout with the Theosophical Society residents and staff members, Emma and Alexis Coulomb, the couple had provided purported correspondence between Blavatsky and Emma to the Madras Christian College magazine, which contained instructions on how to fabricate supernatural happenings. One side of the story has it that the couple had conspired with Christian missionaries to bring down Blavatsky, and whether or not her presentations were mere performance, or if she actually had manifestations of spiritual activity, Blavatsky herself lays out such methods as being easily staged and produced. She notes, however, that the wonders of mesmerism and subjective phenomena defies the tricksters, skepticism, stern science, and dishonest mediums, as the cataleptic state is impossible to feign. And that observation from Blavatsky, even if one considers her character as unscrupulous, is a point which stands on the merit of its evidence.
Okay, continue.
Psychologist and psychoanalyst Carl Jung, he wrote about how the concentration and tension of psychic forces always can make them appear as though magic. The artificial concentration of will induced by hypnosis is of particular interest. Jung speaks of regular demonstrations where he'd take a weak-bodied subject, place them in deep hypnotic trance, and get them to lie across two chairs with the back of the head rested upon one chair and their heels upon the other. He'd leave them there for about a minute, stiff as a board. He'd then select a husky athletic volunteer to repeat the feat with a conscious effort of will, though they'd collapse after a short period with a racing pulse. Mm-hmm. And psychologist, alchemist, and philosopher Jan Baptist von Helmont, who was in like the 1500s to 1600s, was a disciple of Paracelsus. He held the belief that every being possessed celestial power closely allied with heaven, with magnetism being a property of heavenly nature. This magic power, which has potential of being projected or operating externally, lies hidden in the inner man. This power, he said, is asleep until awakened by suggestion, and that it is the Kabbalistic art which has the potential to return the magic and natural strength to the soul. Blavatsky draws correlation from Helmont and Paracelsus' views that the spirit is everywhere, that spirit is the medium of magnetism, and that magic does not consist in superstitious practices and vain ceremonies, but in the imperial will of man. Blavatsky, like Levi, believed in a transcendental magnetism, which depended upon the will and knowledge of the mesmerizer and their capacity to receive impressions from the astral light, so intuitively to draw upon the astral light. Similar to Edgar Cayce, Blavatsky believed that through this process one can access the Book of Life, which is known as the Akashic Records, which he likened to the memory of God.
So even then we can see the intrinsic links between magic and hypnosis as we've been continuing, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Jan Baptist von Helmont, he insisted that we not tremble at the name of magic, which he spelt with a K before Crowley. But like scripture, we should interpret it in good sense. He acknowledges that it can be used for good or ill intent, and that such power can be used or abused. However, he stated, magnetism is not a force of Satan, but is in fact the power of that which is not of Satan. That it is a co-natural power inherent in man, which lays dormant until it is stirred up. If one is to employ the art of the Cabal, they can cause excitement and stir up this power, and do so to their great pleasure. It is this, says Van Helmont, that makes one an adeptus, or obtainer, whose governor is the Spirit of God. And this Spirit of God philosophy goes into the Fire Philosophers, which was a Rosicrucian movement based upon Paracelsian principles. The alchemists, such as Robert Fludd, were the true alchemists, As the true sons of God, they were the light in the word. Flood writes they have Leonum fortitium solum devorantum, which again was my butchering of Latin, which means the strongest lion devouring the sun. It is the false alchemists, intoxicated with ignorance, who toil in vain to make metallic gold, while caring not at all for the heavenly and celestial treasure. That treasure was the quintessence, alluding to the effect of attraction in a magnet and how it can be transferred to iron, which then acts with magnetic properties. Flood compares those who touched and attracted by God's Spirit, how they will then act upon others. These individuals in rapport with God can prophesy, perform miracles, and have familiarity with angelic beings, though these powers will cease if the junction between the higher power and the agent is loosened. And that's similar to like what Eliphas Levi was writing, and when he said, you know, to magnetize, you must have in you the light of truth and the spiritual of righteousness. And perhaps symbolically, the formulation of and the consequent carrying of the Philosopher's Stone is akin to the metaphoric device used by the Eastern esoterics and the Mani Jewel, and they have many other, the Bright Pearl, they have many different symbols for this. H.P. Blavatsky mentioned how formulas are alternative ways of writing, for example, sodium carbonate as Na2CO3 and alcohol as C2H6O, that the alchemists expressed their astrolite, the azoth, by the symbol tarot. And no coincidence, Aleister Crowley's Thoth Tarot deck was elaborately constructed to show, amongst other things, the alchemical process for the formulation of the Philosopher's Stone.
Tarot is sometimes depicted as a cross figure with the 4 letters of T-A-R-O on each end of the limb, or each limb rather, and can be transposed or read in multiple ways, such as tarot, Egyptian for royal, Torah, Hebrew for law, Troa, Hebrew for gate, or rota, Latin for wheel, Orat, Latin for speak, or Teor, Egyptian for the goddess of darkness, Taor, and then Ator, Egyptian goddess Venus, which is Athor. Azoth or Azot has additional peculiarities, such as the AZ or as being the first and last letters of the Latin alphabet. Azo contains alpha and omega, the first and the last letters of the Greek alphabet. Azot contains the aleph and tau, and the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Even beyond this, the word may come from azotus, found in the Bible, Acts 8, verse 40, where Philip was found when the Spirit caught him away.
Yeah, it is said that the Philosopher's Stone cannot be exposed to atmosphere, nor to the gaze of the profane. The stone must be kept in the most secret place of the laboratory, and the possessor must always carry a key to the place where it is kept. The key would not be physical, but an allegorical key to the mysteries, to the understanding. As the stone is not physical, the laboratory is likely ourselves, and our vessel, our body. It is said that those who possess but a single particle of the stone, even so much as a single grain of the divine powder, are able to cure maladies of the soul and body. Albert Pike in Morals and Dogma points out that the alchemical salt, sulfur, and mercury are accessorial elements and passive instruments of the great work. The whole of the great work is dependent upon the internal magnet of Paracelsus. Pike says that this is the azot, the universal magnetic force, the light of life, the astral light, and is the grand magical agent.
Yeah. So going back to the core topic of hypnosis, let's try and etch a timeline. Knowing the difficulty of defining what hypnosis is, I imagine this won't be an easy task. That aside, we should attempt it. So what is the origin of hypnosis?
If we are to take hypnosis as a state, then there is no origin of it any more than there's an origin of something like consciousness itself. Just as there's no origin of happiness or anger, well, perhaps there was an origin of all those things when they first appeared for the very first time in experiential reality somewhere in the annals of time. If we loosen up a little, we can squint at the past and see where hypnosis was being actively employed, as there is arguable evidence for hypnosis being understood and put into practice by the ancient civilizations, from the Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, etc. Babylon and Egypt being especially of interest as they had manifested dream or sleep temples, which we see then appearing in other areas such as India, Greece, and Rome.
So hypnosis is nothing new and it's always been around. We can say with certainty that at least wherever there are people, there has always been hypnosis.
Exactly. Primitive hypnotic forms were used in the early mystery schools, in their magic rituals, in their utilizing rhythmic drumming, repetition, orgiastic rites, theatrics, and suggestions to bring about a pitch of hysteria.
Yeah.
These such methods were prevalent well into the 18th century when scientific steps were begun to isolate and understand the substance of the art. It has, for example, been said that the priests of Isis understood hypnotism and that practices such as mesmerism were being performed long before the modern world had even dreamed of their existence. As we mentioned earlier with Pythagoras, it's been said that he has been known to, use it. And this was found in the writings of Manly P. Hall, who had written that Pythagoras possessed hypnotic power not only over man, but also over animals too.
I'm sure some may question his sources. Is there something more concrete that we can look to when it comes to hypnosis and its origins, such as early written records?
As for written records mentioning hypnosis, from Egypt we have a medical text covering mental and physical disorders, which has been coined the Ebers Papyrus, discovered by George Ebers sometime between 1873 and 74. The origin of the papyrus has been traced to about 1550 BCE. A portion of it, however, makes reference to the Lower Egyptian Den, which some scholars then imply would date it closer to about 3000 BCE.
Wow.
Theories have been put forth that it's possibly a copy of an ancient book written by Thoth himself.
Oh, Thoth. So finally a name that I'm most familiar with. Thoth being the father of medicine, science, religion, philosophy, the future, and of course, magic. But of course, with the future, he'll never actually tell you, so don't ask him.
The Ebers Papyrus, in addition to being one of the oldest known medical works containing 700 magical formulas and folk remedies, also features hypnosis-like procedures such as eye fixation techniques and trance induction.
That's really interesting. So this would then tie into sleep temples, which I love. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So while there is no generic label to apply to them all, for convenience sake, I'll not shy away to label pretty much all Egyptian or Greek healing temples as sleep or dream temples wherever possible, even if it may anger some in my doing, because it was within these walls of these temples that the nature of hypnosis was viewed as a gift from the gods. To the ancient Egyptians, dream interpretation was a significant practice of the priest class, so we can imagine the significance sleep temples would have held in their time.
You mentioned Greek sleep temples. Was that similar or the same?
Yeah, in Greece there were temples of Isis that had required priests to offer approval of those who would need to first apply for visitation rites, which they do by relaying their dreams received from the goddess. These dreams, of course, had to indicate that they required a visit to these temples.
Right.
They would be admitted if their reason for staying was determined to be valid, but this exclusivity was not uniform. There were also temples that were open to everyone. These public temples were called an Asclepion. Asclepion was sacred to the god of healing, medicine, and rejuvenation. Visiting these temples was at one time one of the most popular religious rites people could participate in. The god from whom these temples took their name, Asclepius, is known for his snake-entwined staff, the rod of Asclepius, also known as the Asclepion.
Yeah, and it happens to still serve this day as a symbol of medicine.
Yeah. Asclepius was associated with the Roman god of medicine, Vejovis, to who in the spring season goats were sacrificed to in order to avert plagues, and in addition to that oddity, Asclepius was associated to the Egyptian god Imhotep, to whom Egyptian sleep temples were viewed as being under the influence of, as well as being under the influence of Thoth. Like the Egyptians who would undergo ritual cleansing prior to visiting temples for divine dreams, the Greeks had done similar practices prior to incubation.
Could you take us through the process of dream incubation?
Greek dream incubation, known as enkoimesis, was the practice of visiting these sacred temples and sanctuaries of beauty and divinely inspired design for the purpose of receiving healing and a connection to the gods. Some dream incubation rituals included the sacrifice of animals such as rams and goats, though this was not a necessity, and other offerings could be made in substitute. Where sacrifices of animals were made, the offerer would then be able to use the skin as a blanket when sleeping overnight at the temple, or would sleep near their offering for its influence upon their dream. Come morning, the temple's clergy would, if required, interpret the dreams had at the temple, and accordingly, such dreams experienced during stays were viewed as taking precedence over regular dreams in terms of their authority and significance. Scott Cunningham offers a comprehensive look at the subject of dream incubation in his book Dreaming the Divine, Techniques for Sacred Sleep, in which he lays out that the Greeks' initial beliefs were that the divine dreams were sent by their god Zeus, and in later times were received from Athena, Artemis, Asclepios, Hermes as the emissary of Zeus and as a giver of refreshing sleep, and also Pan, who Cunningham indicates was a conductor of dreams, amongst other deities.
That's really fascinating.
And I know you're a big fan of Scott Cunningham's work.
Yeah, I am. He's one of the, what you consider like to be one of the granddaddies of modern witchcraft and Wicca specifically. Unfortunately, he did pass away back in the early 90s, but he left behind a huge legacy of information and books. So if you are new to the world of witchcraft and the occult, or you just want to get an idea of why some people call themselves witches, or at least understanding where the basis of our education comes from, Scott Cunningham is one of those people that I would highly recommend checking out. When you talk of hypnosis, you mentioned it being the core of religion.
Mm-hmm. We quoted Dr. Margaretta K. Bowers, who said, whether or not the religionist approves or disapproves, every time they make use of ritual, preaching, and worship, they unavoidably make use of hypnotic techniques. And she went one step further by saying that hypnosis is the vehicle by which the services of religion are brought to the people. If we enter into talking about mysticism and mystical practice, the connections become greatly evident. However, should we choose to, we may even spot hypnosis in the Bible, as it has been proposed by a number of people, both scholarly and not so scholarly, that Genesis 2, verse 21 is the first ever instance of hypnosis, where it reads, "And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept."
But he may have just put him to sleep, right? Or
And if that's not convincing to you, a little harder to deny would be within Mark 16, verse 18, where it states that they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. The matter of the laying of hands being a practice known as the Thammaturgic Touch, which we see to this day performed by figures such as the Pope, and is in use by other alternative health practitioners, such as those using Reiki, with its laying of the hands. In our slow step towards the solidification of like a timeline of hypnosis, from mentioning the Thammaturgic Touch, it may be worth noting the Royal Touch, a practice from approximately 1000 to 1400 AD, where in England and France, the kings and queens claimed to possess this divine gift of the healing touch and would lay their hands upon the sick, the submissive, and the suffering, to questionable ends.
don't think they found much success with that, did they?
No. And perhaps what was missing from this was what Theophrastus Bombastus, also known as Paracelsus, introduced us to in the treatment of mind and body, with his theory that we have two bodies, one being visible and the other invisible. The invisible body was attuned to the imagination and the spiritual aspects of the individual. In order to receive treatment, Paracelsus believed there was a requirement of cooperation from the inner physician, and stressed the importance of imagination, that we should all know what can be accomplished from a strong imagination, as it is the principle of all magical action.
Wow. So you can't underestimate the powers of imagination. We create what we think.
And it may be that by the strength of the imagination, or the empowering of it, that we end up inventing what we believe hypnosis is to be based on our expectations or a willingness to play along with the act presented by a hypnotist, or our preconceived idea of what it is. Whether they be a professional within a therapist's office with credentials and diplomas lining their walls to sell you on their authority, or a priest in a temple pointing magic wands or rods and chanting, we create the hypnotic trance state to fulfill our role in the interaction when undergoing external stimulation, and best utilize the environment to induce the trance successfully. This rather sticky matter has opened theories of hypnosis not actually being real, and unfortunately with that line of thinking, it is dismissed as being only the result of a person playing the role of what a hypnotized client is supposed to look like or act like. And some may view this as tad close-minded, Yet it doesn't matter if the actuality of hypnotic trance is denied or not. We know that the results from the belief are real and valid in their proofs, similar to the example of the placebo effect, which hints that the power of suggestion lies at the root of hypnosis, and this very fact seems to haunt the standard medical model, which has not yet got a place for hypnotic phenomena. Well, not much of a place anyways. And from my perspective, the idea of our imagination being the powerful element in hypnosis makes it all the more alluring. Rather than bending me towards a dismissal of the phenomenon, I lean into it. The father of conversational hypnosis, Milton Erickson, had the most appropriate dictum of, it's the patient who does the therapy.
Yeah, so you've got the book here on the table.
And I pulled it as in the Teaching Tales of Milton Erickson, my voice will go with you, he writes of a patient in a case titled Auto-Hypnosis, and in it, there was a woman who felt herself neurotic, but she couldn't or wouldn't speak to anyone and describe to them what her problem was. She once asked Erickson for permission, which he granted, that she may pull into his driveway at night, and she wished to imagine him leaving the house and then entering and sitting in the car with her, in order for her to meditate upon or think through her problem. After paying for 2 sessions, she eventually told him she was over her problem, and then had volunteered herself to work with him, so Erickson put her to use within time distortion experiments. In this case, we can see that in her act of driving to a location approximate in closeness to him, and then through the role-playing this aloud, through an enabling of the imagination, she was able to facilitate a hallucination of him exiting the house, and then created the ideal conversation and provided herself with the answers to what was previously unsolvable to her. Despite his physical absence in the car, she relieved herself of the problem by working through it mentally in a way that she was unable to do on her own, within her own meditations in her own home, where she was more bound to conditions, trapped within the confines of her own routines and her normal mode of thinking.
Wow, that's actually really interesting. The idea that she could figure out by herself that she needed to do it by herself.
And many theories about hypnosis have been put forth, such as the theory of neo-dissociation by Ernest Hilgard, a psychologist and professor at Stanford University, who came to the conclusion that hypnotic subjects divide their consciousness voluntarily. A large part of this theory is that each of us has what he called a hidden observer. The idea of a hidden observer, which we can view as a reflection of Paracelsus' concept of the inner physician, are not in any ways unique. We can look to the daemon of Stoicism, or the more modern Holy Guardian Angel, or HGA, of Thelema. In fact, this duality of personality is a reoccurring belief found within many philosophic, esoteric, and mystical traditions.
That's very true. That is very, very true.
And just to get back onto the road of our timeline of hypnosis, to examine a bit more of the advancement of hypnosis and animal magnetism, in 1646, the German Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kirchner wrote of hypnotizing a chicken in his Experimentum Mirabile de Imagination Galinae by holding its head down and drawing a line on the ground with a piece of chalk starting from its beak. Another Jesuit, Father Maximilian Hell, known mostly for his once very controversial astronomical work on his observation of Venus's transit, also took to the study of the effects of magnetism and healing with magnets, which helped progress the development of Paracelsus' theory of animal magnetism. This experimentation with magnets at the time was more easily facilitated due to John Canton's discovery on how to make artificial magnets by rubbing iron or steel. Through the lens of what we know so far of hypnosis and the participation required of both parties involved, hypnotee and hypnotist, we can see why Hell may have attained such strong results and cures in his experiments. Hell's method of healing would attract one Franz Anton Mesmer, who had apparently gone on to borrow some of Hell's magnets, and, like with Paracelsus giving us the word bombast, it's from Mesmer where we obviously get the term mesmerism. Mesmer's method was all about theatrics, and to get an idea of some of his antics, he walked about in a coat of lilac silk and touched people with a long iron wand. He used the hypnotic gaze and made what are called mesmeric passes with his hands, etc., to hypnotize people.
But as he was working with them, that's actually pretty interesting. I can't help but point out that in many minds, wasn't Mesmer debunked?
Yeah, this comes from 1784, where a royal commission headed by Benjamin Franklin, and yes, it's that Benjamin Franklin.
Hundreds!
He discredited the theory of invisible natural force, the magnetic fluid, also known as the Lebensmagnetismus, by doing a controlled clinical trial which saw one of Mesmer's adept associates, Dr. Charles Deslin, magnetizing a tree in Franklin's garden. A blindfolded boy was then instructed to embrace the tree Deslin had worked upon, guiding himself through the garden by magnetic influence. This act failed and was seen to debunk Mesmer's theory of the magnetic fluid, and the art was then viewed with more scrutiny and was considered unscientific. Mesmer's advances of hypnosis and his previous results were viewed as merely being the powers of an overactive imagination. This wasn't the death of hypnosis, however. Like with Kirshner's chicken, British Dr. James Braid, he largely utilized eye fixation, as well as relaxation techniques to induce trance. And no, he didn't draw a line from people's nose with chalk and hold their head to the ground. Braid is often credited as being one of the first to use the English words hypnotism, hypnotize, and hypnotist, and is often credited with coining the term hypnosis from the Greek hypnos for sleep, though the sleep referred to by Braid being one used metaphorically and not signifying the inducement of an actual state of sleep. His use of the word first appeared in a short 12-page book entitled Satanic Agency in Mesmerism Reviewed in a letter to the Reverend H. M. C. Neal, A.M. of Liverpool, in reply to a sermon preached by him in St. Jude's Church, Liverpool, on Sunday, April 10th, 1842. I'm sure 3 of those pages must have just been the title alone.
Yeah, they did a lot of stuff like that back then. There's a sort of text that I had to study with my degree. The titles just went on and on and on and on and on. And even people now who edit those books, they give you like a partial title and then they dedicate the rest of the title for the entire first page.
Yeah. And in that book, Braid had laid out the foundation for medical hypnosis and refuted the claims that mesmerism's effects were of some inauspicious influence by stating, "Supposing my theories did not explain the whole of the phenomena, surely, when beneficial application could be made to the extent of knowledge that we had acquired, we ought to be at liberty to do so without being stigmatized from the pulpit as necromancers or producing our effects by satanic agency." Braid's experiments and writings see him take the position as the father of hypnosis in many minds, and his experiences with self-hypnosis or auto-hypnosis helped to not only demystify hypnotism, but also brought to public light that one didn't rely solely on the gaze, charisma, or magnetism of an external operator, but rather that each individual had their own part to play in the hypnotic experience.
Yeah, I'm sure we have overlooked names and influences on hypnotism and haven't followed its full development to a modern conceptualization of hypnosis. Absent are many individuals and their works. Believe me, if we did add them, they would have continued for a very long time and this podcast would never end.
Yeah, and the collection of all the information that we've provided is hopefully enough that people are starting to grasp these concepts in a much more truer vein.
It should be a good primer, a good starting point if you are interested. So, what about the spiritual and the supernatural?
This is the juicy stuff for a lot of people. Hypnosis is united with magic and miracles. I find it hard to think of a single occult activity which isn't able to be placed upon a branch of the tree we can label as hypnosis. The brilliant Arthur Schopenhauer wrote extensively on the intrinsic link between magic and hypnotism, which was then known as animal magnetism, in his On the Will in Nature, published in 1836. An entire chapter was dedicated to this, in fact. Common sense just seems to link the two. Eliphas Levi, who we've quoted many times now, he too stated that the science of miracles is the knowledge of this force, and the art of doing miracles is but the art of magnetizing or illuminating beings according to the invariable laws of magnetism or astral light. To understand and use the force of magnetism, but to never be obsessed and overcome by it, is to trample on the head of the serpent. Levi in the History of Magic states that it's from the magic of light that we learn all secrets and mysteries of magnetism. That for the initiated, magnetism is the wand of miracles. For others who are rash and would sport with it or be blind to their passions, it's dangerous. Writing on the drastic change brought to his life, Drunvalo Melchizedek, in The Ancient Secrets of the Flower of Life, Volume 2, mentions hypnosis a few times, and the benefits it had for he and his wife. He provides testimony that the practice had allowed the couple to learn how to leave their bodies, and that they had even found accuracy in their experimentations of ESP. Perhaps most interestingly, he tells of an instance where he had hypnotized his wife as to take away her pain and to soothe her skin after she had inadvertently carried a hot cast iron pan that he had been drying on the stove and he had forgotten about. That is, he forgot about it until he saw it in her hands, and unable to prevent her from grabbing it. This intense moment led to an instance of healing, which confirmed to Melchizedek that what society had told him about reality was not true, and instilled the belief, or rather the knowing, that the body is light and that it responds to consciousness. On another page, he brings up hypnosis while mentioning that the existence of entities or dysfunctional spirits and energies have become much more understood with the easy method of release.
So spirits. Do you have any more connections between the spiritual and hypnosis?
Yes. Psychoanalyst Dr. Nandor Fodor said that the nature of hypnotic trance is unknown, and pointed out that its relation to the mediumistic trance is of absorbing interest. To students of history, it's rather interesting, as the early history of mesmerism and spiritual mediumship have many correlations with many spiritualists in the 1800s having started as mesmerist hypnotists, and they were converted along the way in their experiences. Even Dr. Shafika Carigula, who is a medical doctor, in her book Breakthrough to Creativity, wrote that hypnosis can open the door to one's mind, which can be influenced by other intelligences, some greater than our own. She warned that in such a passive state, an entity can get in and obtain control of you.
Yes, that's very, very true. I will talk about spirit possession, well, not possession, but spirit communication in another podcast episode in the future. But that reminds me very much of some of the techniques that I was taught when contacting spirits. What other occult matters tie into hypnosis?
There's water witching, which is dousing. Ouija boards. The pendulum and the planchette are all tools of occultism which employ hypnosis and depend upon the involuntary or idiomotor muscular responses associated with the audiosensory processes. Well, according to some, it's the work of spirits, ghosts, and the supernatural influences on our world. Those more scientifically inclined and naturally skeptical will say that subcortical mechanisms are entirely responsible for the primary or inherited responses manifested as involuntary reflexes.
Yeah.
That isn't to say that scientific-minded people can't believe as well in external influences acting upon humankind. There are, of course, infinitesimal ways to perceive the world, and there's no fixed consensus of reality amongst any large grouping of people.
You got me thinking. With bringing up spirit possession, Ouija, and hypnosis, this is starting to sound a lot like the Exorcist films.
And the Ouija board is just a rather peculiar piece of wood. Ouija takes its name from the French oui and the German ja, both words meaning yes. So it's the yes, yes. It's a flat board containing numbers 0 to 9, the letters of the alphabet, as well as a greeting and departing words such as hello and goodbye. Aleister Crowley encouraged the use of the device, but didn't view it as a mere plaything. Crowley and Charles Stenfeld Jones frequently wrote to each other about the Ouija board and its use in their unpublished letters. At one time, the pair were even planning a business venture that would see them creating their own design of the spirit board, being released under a new name.
Oh my god, imagine if they were alive today. That would be like one of the most amazing Kickstarters of our time.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it never came to fruition, and consequently, the designs never made it to our eyes, so we don't know what it would have looked like. While the Ouija board is famous for its aesthetic, the triangle planchette that one or more people lay their hands upon to speak with their subconscious, with the dead, with angels, or other intelligence. Before the popularity of the board, planchettes on casters were sometimes used, along with a pencil attached for communication with spirits as a form of automatic writing.
Yes. People remember in my early YouTube videos, I used to do such automatic writing. While I have a practical experience of it, I've never looked up the subject in depth. Are there any studies on this?
Yeah. William James, who we've brought up now a few times, in the Principles of Psychology, in the chapter devoted to hypnotism, it details the experiments of psychologist Edmund Gurney, where Gurney had tapped the second consciousness by means of the planchette. He had found in these experiments that hypnotic subjects and automatic writers would demonstrate, once awakened from a trance, that they could write out unconsciously the order of suggestions given to them. This, to Gurney, had demonstrated that something inside of them, which could express itself through the hand alone, was continuing to think of the order, which opened new possibilities into experimental investigations of the so-called second states of the personality.
Yeah.
Automatic writing is still done in hypnosis and hypnotherapy. The technique can be used to reveal material that the conscious mind has suppressed and has a strong aversion to look at. To do automatic writing, the hypnotist would induce a trance and dissociate the arm or hand of the patient that will be writing, releasing the hand from cortical control. This method can be used in a variety of ways, from the elicitation of repressed memories to communication with the subconscious. Other mediums enter trance and allow their limb to become possessed by nearby spirits wishing to communicate messages from beyond.
Yeah, that is very, 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 very true. So I knew a little bit about that already. We can't keep bringing up possession of spirits and not go into details. Now, come on.
So let's draw again upon the work of Colin Wilson.
Okay.
In his book Poltergeist, A Study in Destructive Haunting, he lays out multiple cases which coincidentally involve hypnosis. In one, a woman who had been experiencing two personalities since childhood had each personality brought forth in hypnosis, and was given an order for the personalities to blend, which had no effect. Further hypnosis was done, which led to hypnotic syncope, which is unconsciousness, where the body appeared lifeless as though dead, and then the body spoke, though what spoke was a wiser and firm voice of an elderly man who explained that the two girls' personalities were under its guardianship and told the doctors that what they were doing was wrong. When threatened with further hypnosis, the entity made a threat back that it would abandon the body and leave them there with a corpse.
That is pretty spooky.
Yeah. In The Principles of Psychology, William James, this is just something that's kind of an oddity. William James stated that medium trances are indistinguishable from efforts of hypnotic suggestion, with the subject taking the role of a medium simply due to the conditions they are present in and the expectations placed upon them. And they live it out based on their histrionic, melodramatic, theatrical gifts. The oddity of this, however, is that the persons who had been entirely unexposed to spiritualist traditions would enact the medium role with the same qualities when entranced, from speaking in the names of the departed, going through death agonies, describing ailments of those present, all while having no theory on this to publish. James stated to have seen it personally on many different occasions.
We've spoken about mediums, so what about psychics?
Yeah, if people are to name a psychic that they have heard of from any point in history, Edgar Cayce is probably the name to come to mind for the vast majority.
Yeah.
At one point in his life, Cayce had lost his voice, and so he underwent hypnotherapy to see if the condition can be relieved. And while he was able to speak in trance, when he returned from it, his voice would disappear again. Another hypnotist had taken over the case and suggested that Cayce describe the condition whilst in trance. However, Cayce, once in an altered state of consciousness, responded by referring to himself as we instead of I.
Yeah.
And in subsequent sessions, when Cayce would enter trance, he would signal the presence of the entity by stating, "We have the body." After restoring his voice, Cayce would become one of the most famous psychics and holistic healers of his time. He was not without criticism and controversy, of course.
Yeah.
Cayce had attributed most of the information he gained psychically to the Akashic Records, or as it's referred to as in scripture, the Book of Life. Akasha is a term for open sky, space, or ether, ether being the classical element also called the quintessence, denoting the non-physical plane of existence. The Akashic plane is seen to hold records of all human events and possibilities past, present, and future. Theosophist Rudolf Steiner claimed to access aspects of Jesus' life that were not written in the four Gospels, and he produced the fifth Gospel from the Akashic Record. The concept of the Akashic Record is often used as a creative visualization technique in hypnosis for people to visit their books of life on a journey into the hall of the Akashic Records.
Yeah.
And from there, they may obtain a new perspective on their life and their soul lessons. And this may also be used as a creative tool to trigger the creation of fictional stories or events.
Yeah, that's true. On the topic of arts, I know you had put together some information on hypnosis and the arts. But I suggest that we leave that for a future episode.
At the top of this episode, we had raised the question, was Aleister Crowley, the master magician, a master hypnotist? We'll examine some evidence of this and another short quote from his writings.
Okay, so I've got it here. The essence of the idea of trance is indeed contained in that of magic, which is preeminently the transcendental science and art. Its method is, in a chief sense, love, the very key of trance, and in another, the passing beyond normal conditions. The verbs to transcend, to transmit, to transcribe, and their like are of all cardinal virtue in magic. Hence, love is the law, love under will, is the supreme epitome of magical doctrine and universal formula. For need any man fear the state boldly, that every magical operation soever is only complete when it is characterised, in one sense or another, by the occurrence of trance. Aleister Crowley.
Aleister Crowley was a hypnotist, is what I'd claim. Not without evidence. For some fun, let's start connecting some of the coincidences around the man and see how many times magnetism or hypnotism appear in relation to him or his work without the need of diving into his actual writings or practices.
So, how shall we explore this?
Crowley required a vehicle for the promulgation of his Thelema, and he had made that vehicle the OTO.
Ah, yes, the Ordo Templi Orientis.
Crowley's Thelema borrowed from the Egyptian pantheon, utilizing Nuit, Hadit, and Rahur Kuit for his allegorical verses found within the core text, which Crowley delivered as prophet of the Aeon, whose word was Thelema, and that text was the Book of the Law,
known as Liber Alvel Legis.
The OTO was most fitting, being an offshoot branch of the Memphis Mizraim rite of Freemasonry, which was also known as Egyptian Freemasonry. The OTO was different from the ancient rite, as it allowed women initiates.
Ooh.
Theodor Reuss, along with Karl Kellner, started the order, and he had succeeded Kellner after his death to become the head of the OTO. Reuss received the right to perform the rite of Memphis and Mizraim from John Yarker, and the right to perform other Martinist rites from Gerald Oncaus, who was also known as Papus, a nom de plume he borrowed from the Noctimeron of Apollonius of Tyana, which was translated by Eliphas Levi. Oncaus provided much assistance to Reuss with the establishment of the system which Crowley would later utilize, such as assisting with setting up the OTO Gnostic Catholic Church.
Yes.
And it should be noted that Gerald Oncaus took the name of Papus from a list of genii, as its name is translated as physician, making it a most fitting title, as Oncaus was, of course, a renowned hypnotist. And since I can't speak French, I need you to pronounce the rest of this. Being the head of the...
Laboratoire de Hypnologie at the Hospital de la Charité, and was editor-in-chief of the Revue de Hypnologie, as well as being the co-founder of the journal L'Initiation,
which looked at hypnotism, magnetism, occultism, and Kabbalah.
Yeah, I just need to read the French.
Oncaus was not only a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in Paris, he had also founded the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Croix, as well as the modern Martinist Order, which in turn, Reuss would become Special Inspector for the Martinist Order within Germany. Mm-hmm. Reuss was also assisted in setting up the OTO by the occultist, author, and Freemason we previously mentioned in John Yarker. Yarker wrote a text titled Arcane Schools, published in 1909, which we offer the following quote from.
Yeah. What in these times is called hypnotism, mesmerism, trance, was well known to the ancients.
Reuss would confer upon Crowley several high-rank Masonic degrees, and Crowley would write works in return, which he had dedicated to Reuss, including a play and poetry collection. One of Crowley's masterpieces, Liber 15, otherwise known as the Gnostic Mask, was written for Reuss, which Reuss translated into German and published in 1918. Crowley would eventually write letters to a friend, Frank Bennett, expressing doubt on Reuss's ability to effectively govern the order, and on November 9th, 1921, Reuss had responded in correspondence to Crowley, having heard of the cynical remarks.
Gosh, such riveting drama. Honestly, Crowley was full of drama.
And of course, this resulted in Reuss distancing himself not only from the OTO, but also from Thelema. This allowed Crowley to controversially claim the title of Outer Head of the Order in 1923, before being voted in officially for the position in the year of 1925.
It's funny because that happened in Crowley's time, but something similar is happening now. But we digress. We'll go back to the podcast.
As with Royce, Aleister Crowley too was an acquaintance of John Yarker, who had happened to be the one who had introduced Crowley to Freemasonry and thus the OTO.
In Aleister Crowley in America, Art, Espionage and Sex Magic in the New World, author Tobias Churton mentions in an incident where Crowley had picked up a book from his shelf, the book being a gift from the late Yarker, which just so happened to be Magnetism by Jules Dennis, who were under also a nom de plume of Baron du Portet. And Crowley, having a moment of realization, was struck fascinated by the link between ritual and the phenomenon of that book coming into his hand.
Now, I'm uncertain if Churton's reference is to Dennis's introduction to animal magnetism or La Magie dévoilée, which translate as Magic Unveiled and was published in English as Magnetism and Magic. However, Dennis's work Magic and Magnetism mentions that all magical working is done through magnetism, and that in magnetism is the presence of magic.
Yeah.
Ironic of Yarker to gift this book to Crowley, if it is the book referred to above, as it also reads, many magnetizers used magic unconsciously. Freemasonry contains this knowledge, but is powerless, retaining nothing but the words, and so is ineffective. The book also happens to look at sleep temples and has a sentiment of life is hypnosis.
Yeah.
Royce and Crowley had a falling out, as would nearly everyone Crowley came into contact with, conflict being a dominant and rather unfortunate theme with Crowley's life. One such an individual who had a tremendous fall was Charles Stanfield Jones, who we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
He was also known as Freud or Akkad. Akkad was a disciple of the Great Beast, and he was viewed at one time with such an affinity that Crowley had proclaimed him his magical son. And at Crowley's advice to acquaint himself with psychological literature, Jones happened to read Suggestion and Autosuggestion by Charles Baudouin, and found it of great interest, sparking much enthusiasm to explore the matter deeper. Charles Baudouin was a psychoanalyst, and of course was a hypnotist who had fond appreciation for psychoanalysis's origins within the frame of hypnosis, and so his work on autosuggestion inspired Freud or Akkad to delve into the subject, which led him to the work of a man known as the father of modern self-hypnosis, Emile Coué.
Yeah.
Jones' idea was one that he had called psychomagia, which was a further development of the Coué system, with other influences that would see psychology, psychoanalysis, and magic brought together under the motto of the science and art of changing the mind at will. Unfortunately, this movement didn't grow into anything of worth. Akkad would eventually suffer a nervous breakdown and found himself expelled by Crowley from his order. Akkad looked to spread magic in Thelema by bringing it into prominence with the aid of more mainstream and approachable topics like psychology and psychoanalysis, which would have been done through better understanding hypnosis. Crowley had the synchronicity with the book on hypnosis, and his structure for his philosophy was established by hypnotists. But we're far from done at looking at this growing list of connections. Let's take a moment to entertain the main objection to the sticky situation and the increasing appearances of links between hypnosis and Crowley.
What is the main objection that one might have?
The main objection is this link of hypnosis and magic, and that is due to, in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the neophyte obligation required all oath takers to read the following oath.
Which I have just here. I will not suffer myself to be hypnotized or mesmerized, nor will I place myself in such a passive state that any uninitiated person, power, or being may cause me to lose control of my thoughts, words, or actions.
And I would highlight here the importance of not skipping over the word uninitiated person. Oddly, this same oath found its way into the first degree initiations of the OTO, where initiates would swear that I will not submit myself to be hypnotized, mesmerized, blah, 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 blah. Not only this dreaded hypnotic influence they swore against, but they also solemnly swore, I will not indulge unduly in any drugs such as alcohol, ether, opium, hashish, or cocaine, whereby my full consciousness and free will might be impaired. Covering themselves further, they swore that they will not fall unduly under the influence of any person without the mention of mesmerism, where one's free will might be impaired. They then swore obedience to the laws of the order and the particular rulings of the superior of the order, that under no less a penalty on the violation of any one of them, that of having their throat pierced with a dagger and their carcass thrown to the monsters of the sea so that they may be devoured. They really like hyperbolic speech. Those initiates must have been kept at an arm's length from Crowley, who loved using ether in rituals and drugging others unscrupulously.
Yeah.
The point of the initiation ritual of the neophyte had been designed around the idea that the presiding officers were attracting the divine light into the hall and then with spiritual magnetism planting this into the aspirant's aura or sphere of sensation. The word neophyte meaning newly planted from the Greek neophytos. The initiation was the spiritual magnetism planted. The purpose of the ritual, therefore, was an act of magnetism. The ritual itself, to me, is obviously one of hypnotism. As stated in Eliphas Levi's Transcendental Magic, its doctrine and ritual, what the adepts term dead substances are bodies as found in nature. Living substances are those which have been assimilated and magnetized by the science and the will of the operator. Therefore, the great work is something more than a chemical operation. It is an actual creation of the human word, initiated into the power of the word of God himself.
Wow.
Eliphas Levi would also write that hypnotism with 2 participants is without a doubt a marvelous discovery, but hypnotism with a single participant who renders himself lucid at will and who directs himself is a perfection of the magical art. And he noted that the secret of this great work is not lost. It was known and practiced by a large number of initiates, most of all by the celebrated Apollonius of Tyana.
Yeah, there's that name again.
Yes, which, if we recall, was from the work where hypnotist Gerald Onkos took his nom de plume of Papus.
Yeah.
Crowley's whole teaching of Thelema is centered upon will, as Thelema is the Greek translation of will. Levi revealed that what is referred to as the astral light has a direct effect upon our nerves, that the astral light is the physical soul of the 4 elements, and that the empire of will over the astral light is symbolized in magic by the use of the pentagram. So Levi's remarks about hypnotism with a single participant rendering himself lucid and directing himself is a transcending of the conditioned form, like in Buddhism, and is then an acting from enlightenment, which is magic.
Yeah, that's fitting to Crowley's definition of magic, being the science of art and causing change in conformity with will.
Yes, and Levi's work revealed the meanings of many magic symbols, such as explaining that the caduceus, the 2 serpents entwined about a staff, represents the secret of magnetism. He wrote, "To rule the fatality of the ob by intelligence and the power of the ode, so as to create the perfect balance of our. The right-hand serpent is ode, which represents the magnetism controlled by the will of the operator. The left-hand serpent is the ob, and represents the magnetism of passive clairvoyance, and in their middle, at the top of the hermetic staff, shines the golden globe, which represents our, the light in equilibrium, and our also is alchemical gold as well. The symbol of the caduceus is famously found emanating from the lap of Baphomet, which represents Levi's equilibrium of the opposites essential to his magnetism. Crowley would take up Baphomet as one of his magical names, and Levi's drawing of the Baphomet is one of the most iconic occult images known today. Crowley's Book of the Law established that every man and every woman is a star, and that do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law, love is the law, love under will. Levi's work laid out that true love, natural love, was the miracle of magnetism. He had also warned readers that in order to magnetize, one must be wise and righteous and have in them the light of life. Those who are not in right frame of mind, who do not carry the light of life, he had warned that they do not magnetize, but will merely fascinate. This leads fools astray, and eventually leads to one's own burning out, having sapped themselves of their willpower. Levi speaks of the church and mentions that fascination is one of its chief powers which were to be used for good or ill, and insisted that the church must condemn magic, as she had made it her own monopoly, as she uses the occult forces to deceive and subjugate the masses. And it should be no surprise that Crowley considered himself a reincarnation of Levi, having taken up his mantle and his work. In fact, when Crowley had been writing his thesis for the grade of Ademptus Exemptus, which was the highest attainable grade by living beings in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, he had been collecting ideas when he came across Levi's Le Clef des Grands Mysteries, and found that the work said all that he could or was intending to say, so he had abandoned writing original work and simply translated the masterpiece into English, bringing us The Key of the Mysteries. Translating a work called The Key of the Mysteries and having a majority of the work about magnetism apparently isn't strong enough of a tie of the occult to hypnosis for those who turn from the connection. Crowley considered himself a continuation of Levi, whose body of work was mostly about magnetism. That wasn't enough, though Crowley finds himself more bound to the matter as we continue further in our investigating. Another example to present could be that in August of 1914, an article found its way into New York World magazine detailing Aleister Crowley attending an alleged black mass. Tobias Churton wrote in America, Art, Espionage, and Sex Magic in the New World that in December of the same year that Crowley denied that he had participated in such a ceremony, and Crowley asserted that he had hypnotized the newspaper man who had wrote the article.
Crowley may have admitted to performing hypnosis in defense of himself being slandered in the newspaper. Is it a coincidence that others describe him as a hypnotist as well, in both flattering and non-flattering ways?
Not at all. Occultist Dion Fortune had a rather tumultuous relationship with Crowley, though despite this, it is rumored that in his dying years, she had visited him and frequently kept him company. A fun aspect of Fortune's novels was the fact that she laid fiction over top of reality. Take, for instance, her novel The Secrets of Dr. Taverner, which is said to be based on Fortune's spiritual teacher, Dr. Moriarty. Her introduction to the book even states that the key location of the book, Taverner's mysterious nursing home, was actually fact, and that life is infinitely stranger than fiction could possibly be. Dr. Taverner is a psychiatrist of sorts who has excellent control of hypnotic powers. One of the cases in the short story collection reads, "It was Taverner's custom at certain times and seasons to do what I shall call hypnotize himself. He, however, called it going subconscious, and declared that by means of concentration he shifted the focus of his attention from the external world to the world of thought." Fortune had also wrote in her book on psychic self-defense that she was convinced that hypnotic methods were largely used in black magic and telepathic suggestion was a large proportion of its phenomena. Like with Moriarty appearing as Taverner, Fortune's inspiration for fictional characters were more commonly plucked from the likenesses of those she encountered in the real world. Take her 1935 novel, The Winged Bull's main antagonist, as he was supposedly based upon Aleister Crowley, presented as a black magician named Astley. In the novel, Astley has psychic control over a woman named Ursula and plans on using her in a Black Lodge black magic ritual, possibly as a sacrifice. One scene in the book has the characters talking with a doctor about the hypnotic control Astley has over Ursula, and all are flabbergasted by the domineering ability of the villain. Astley knows more about the rare aspects of hypnosis than any man in Europe. I know a good deal about it, but I can't hold a candle to Astley.
So we will surely be doing a few episodes on Dion Fortune in the future because, again, she's one of the granddaddies of modern witchcraft and the occult. Oh, grandmamas, yeah.
Back to this idea or character of Aleister Crowley as a hypnotism-wielding black magician, it could also be found in the character of Oliver Haddo from W. Somerset Maugham's novel, The Magician. Though Aleister Crowley the hypnotist was not just found in fiction or in Crowley's defensive positioning in newspapers, another who had been caught up in Crowley's gaze and was left describing it as hypnotic was occult author Bernard Bromwich, writer of Tibetan Yoga, In Tune with Your Destiny, The Occult Way to Inner Peace, and The Occult Arts of Ancient Egypt.
Bromwich had met Aleister Crowley sometime in 1935 and published an account of their encounter in Light magazine. He met the beast at his Great Ormond Street, London residence and caught Crowley on a night when his asthma was bothering him, describing Crowley's voice as being high-pitched and wheezy. When offered by Crowley, Bromwich declined the invitation of his host to eat toffee or drink coffee, having heard of Crowley's want to test drugs on the unsuspecting. It was a rather uneventful evening accounted, though Bromwich at one point was being led around by Crowley, who had been doing a breathing exercise down the back of Bromwich's neck. The way in which this was done had indicated to Bromwich that Crowley had knowledge of the tantric hypnotic system, which he was well able to counter with some astral dexterity, given that Bromwich was more familiar than most with the subject, more familiar than was Crowley. After Crowley retreated, they would engage in a conversation of mundane matters. The beast was living with a woman who Bromwich simply referred to as the Pale Lady, who divulged far too much information about herself, said that she was looking after Crowley, that he needed someone to mother him, and that he was just a child. Of the positives said of Crowley, Bromwich stated that Crowley as an art critic impressed him more than as a magician, though he had to admit that Crowley's hypnotic power was astonishing and that he was able to mollify and talk over a highly reputable solicitor who would come to read the Riot Act when called on Crowley, who was naked, putting on a rite of Pan in the basement of the lodgings he had been kicked out of prior to where he had hosted Bromwich's meeting. This detailed account was the last formal meeting between the two. Though they'd have small run-ins in the future, Bromwich stated that Crowley observed him keenly and tested mental control tricks which would have pulled a fast one on the lesser armed by practice and experience in the matters. He wrote that Crowley was a hypnotist, both natural and trained, of no mean order. I could credit some of the tales I had heard of his immense fascination for women, how granted the time and the date and the loved one all together, they would surrender all that they had, money, titles, social position, to take up their burden and follow him.
It was not only women who would follow him. Crowley would utilize both men and women in hypnotic rites, where either intense erotic arousal or intense fear have been brought about. They have a profound effect on the brain and psyche of the one experiencing the heightened state, and combined with magical words, mantras, and phrases, these have strong hypnotic effects on those within or on the receiving end of a ritual. Multiple religious sects have used prolonged periods of sexual intercourse without orgasm, called kareza, to increase states of suggestibility and to fortify religious faith. Others have used repeated orgasm to achieve deep hysterical trance. Take as example the American revivalism that saw the encouragement of worshippers coming through sexually to Jesus, that with their orgasm it would be taken as a sign of the Holy Ghost entering their lives. The addition of drugs such as hashish were used frequently within ritualistic intercourse for enhanced effect, the goal being to reach a state of euphoria, of ecstasy, or to experience possession by gods or demons. In this possession, one would be prone to hallucinations. Aleister Crowley believed greatly in the power of this method of trance induction. He called it eroto-comatose lucidity and provided details of it in a number of writings. In Liber 414, written in 1914, Crowley would lay out the ritualistic use of eroto-comatose lucidity.
He states that the candidate is made ready for the ordeal by fasting and general athletic training. The candidate then chooses one or more experienced attendants whose duty it is to exhaust the candidate sexually by every known means possible. This will result in the candidate falling into a sleep of utter exhaustion, which Crowley notes resembles the comatose state as it is. From here forth, that exquisite skill and delicacy must be employed. The candidate is roused from sleep by sexual stimulation, and the use of music should be employed if possible. As soon as the candidate is showing signs of waking, the attendants cease activities instantly until the candidate falls back to sleep, and then they continue once more. This commences until the candidate is thrown into a state which is neither sleep nor waking, that Crowley says is a state which the spirit is set free by the exhaustion of the body, and is yet prevented from entering the city of sleep, which allows it to commune with the Most High and Most Holy Lord God of its being, the maker of heaven and earth. The ordeal is finished when the candidate enters an invincible, unpreventable sleep or the success of the ritual. But ultimate waking is done followed by a final performance of the sexual act. The orgasm attained, Crowley calls mors justi, little death, death justified.
It was in 1909 that Crowley utilized sex-induced trance with Victor Newberg in the desert of Algiers, where they performed occult rituals based on the Enochian system of John Dee. Another notable working was when Crowley used the method of erotocomatose lucidity in 1911 with Mary Sturgis, one of Crowley's scarlet women known as Soror Viracom. Sturgis was placed in trance and was possessed by spirits which Crowley questioned. Not that he questioned the trance, but he questioned the spirits which possessed her. H.P. Blavatsky wrote of a similar method to Crowley's rhodocomatose lucidity called the sleep of Salome, and wrote that when one is allowed to remain in this state, their spiritual ego gets to confabulate with the gods. And just kind of something that's coincidental here, but worth noting for the peculiarity of it, the word for confabulate in psychiatry refers to the act of fabricating imagery or imaginary experiences as compensation for the loss of memory, which we know amnesia may be part of the hypnotic trance. And the word confabulate in its regular use means to have conversation. And lastly, there's one other testimony we should highlight, and that is one by Viola Banks, who had acted as an intermediary between Aleister Crowley and Paul Robeson in Crowley's attempt to get the actor to take a leading role in Crowley's play Mortadelo, a play which the Times would call a masterpiece, and the Manchester Guardian would say, "Mr. Crowley is always clever, and some of these experiments are extraordinarily so." Unfortunately, Paul Robeson didn't end up performing his role in the play, though Viola Banks found the urge to write details of her first impressions on meeting Crowley, saying that Crowley had neither the compelling features of a magician nor the strong and nervous hands of a poet. She described his hands as being unusually small, bringing to her mind delicate bird's claws. His voice, which she expected to be sonorous, would prove light and rather high for a man. His eyes, however, captured her, and in them lay the answer to the riddle. Banks describes that through his gaze, Crowley's willpower and deep occult knowledge could dominate a weaker and untrained will to the extent it is called magnetism, and she believed if he had so desired, he could obtain absolute mastery over the mind and body of his subjects. She said if one stared into his eyes, they could scarcely fail to feel the thrill of magnetism that emanated from their green depths.
See, just in case you're wondering, especially if you're looking for love, it's all about personality, and Crowley had it. So, yeah.
And those radiant green eyes. Oh
right?
My.
Those fingers.
Ooh, bird claws. So, yeah. We've now just delved into this matter. I hope it was some good food for thought. Maybe you disagree with me, but I don't really see how when we've looked at all of this material in this episode. Aleister Crowley was a hypnotist. Hypnotism is an integral part of the occult arts. Hypnotism is a massive part of occultism and our daily lives. And we hope this episode just shone a light on that and opened up some possible dialogues for you to have and for you to possibly have with us. So if you wish to engage with us, you can follow us on Instagram at thesate.ca. You can also find us on Twitter. It's thesate.ca without the dot. And
yeah, that's basically it. But let me just quickly spell. It's THESATE.ca or THESATECA.
yeah, the first Instagram, the latter our Twitter handle.
Yeah.
So thank you for your time, and we look forward to
Exploring more.
Yeah. See you in the next episode. Be well.
Imhotep, go in peace.